The night is quiet now. Somewhere beyond the window, perhaps rain taps softly against the glass, or perhaps only the wind is moving through trees that have stood longer than any of us. The modern world hums with distant traffic and glowing screens. Yet tonight we are traveling backward, not to a battlefield where cannons thunder or to a palace where kings whisper over maps, but to sidewalks, to church basements, to crowded buses, to school hallways that should have been ordinary, except history had other plans. The story of the American Civil Rights Movement is remarkable precisely because so much of it happened in places that looked painfully ordinary. No dragons, no castles, no conquering armies. Just ordinary people deciding, one exhausting day after another, that ordinary injustice had lasted long enough. And if history teaches anything, it is that changing the world usually involves much more waiting than anyone expects. So settle in. Dim the lights. Let your breathing slow. Tonight, we walk beside those who marched toward equality. Before anyone marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Before hundreds of thousands gathered beneath the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. Before television cameras carried images of police dogs and fire hoses into millions of American homes. There was simply everyday life. And everyday life, for millions of African Americans in the first half of the 20th century, was carefully organized to remind them exactly where society believed they belonged. Not by accident. By design. Imagine waking before sunrise in a small southern town during the late 1940s. The morning air is already warm. Dew clings to the grass. Somewhere nearby, a rooster announces the dawn with complete confidence, despite having been spectacularly wrong about the weather more than once. Wooden houses sit beneath towering oak trees draped in Spanish moss. A freight train whistles somewhere beyond the fields. The smell of coffee drifts through kitchens where families prepare for another day's work. At first glance, it seems peaceful. But history often hides its sharpest edges beneath calm mornings. As children prepare for school, they already know which building they are allowed to enter. The white school. The black school. Separate. The words sound strangely tidy, almost mathematical. Separate. As though someone simply divided pencils into two boxes. Reality was rarely so neat. White schools often received newer books, new desks, better heating, better laboratories, better funding. Meanwhile, black schools frequently depended on donated textbooks that had already been used for years elsewhere. Sometimes pages were missing. Sometimes covers had disappeared entirely. Students learned algebra from books whose previous owners had scribbled notes across every page. History, perhaps fittingly, came already marked by someone else's handwriting. Education itself became unequal before the first lesson even began. The differences extended everywhere. Hospitals, libraries, restaurants, movie theaters, hotels, parks, swimming pools, railroad stations, public drinking fountains, bathrooms, even cemeteries. Because apparently someone had concluded that segregation should continue after death. History can possess a remarkably dark sense of bureaucracy. Signs appeared everywhere. White, colored. 2 words. Simple words. Ordinary paint. Yet they quietly governed millions of daily decisions. Which entrance? Which seat? Which waiting room? Which window? Which life? Children grew up absorbing these invisible boundaries long before understanding why they existed. Parents often struggled to explain. How do you explain unfairness to a child? Especially when the unfairness has been written into law. Some parents answered carefully. Some answered honestly. Many answered with warnings. Be careful. Don't argue. Keep your head down. The advice was not about surrender. It was about survival. Because challenging the system could carry consequences far beyond embarrassment. A disagreement with the wrong person might cost someone a job, or their home, or their safety, or even their life. The system that governed much of the American South was commonly known as Jim Crow. The name itself came from a racist 19th century minstrel character, which somehow makes the whole thing even more depressing. Imagine constructing an entire legal system around a theatrical caricature. History occasionally achieves levels of absurdity that fiction wisely avoids. Jim Crow laws varied from state to state. Some dictated where people could sit. Others determined whom they could marry. Others restricted voting through literacy tests, poll taxes, intimidation, and outright violence. On paper, the Constitution promised equal protection. In practice, reality often depended upon the color of one's skin. This contradiction haunted American democracy. The United States celebrated liberty, independence, freedom, the right of ordinary citizens to govern themselves. School children memorize the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Beautiful words. Powerful words. Words that echoed through classrooms where not every child possessed the same rights those words described. The irony was impossible to ignore. Yet millions endured it every day. Life continued nevertheless. Families celebrated birthdays. Neighbors attended church. Young couples fell in love. Children invented games. Grandparents told stories on front porches during humid evenings while cicadas sang beneath gathering stars. Human joy proved astonishingly resilient, even under injustice. Perhaps especially under injustice. Churches became far more than places of worship. They served as community centers, schools, meeting halls, safe spaces, places where people could speak more freely than almost anywhere else. Inside these churches, voices rose together in song, not hurried, not polished, but full. Music carried hope when politics offered very little. Old spirituals blended with newer hymns. Voices filled wooden sanctuaries illuminated by afternoon sunlight pouring through stained glass. Those songs would later become the heartbeat of a movement. But for now, they simply reminded people that they were not alone. Across southern cities, black-owned businesses quietly built thriving communities despite countless obstacles. Doctors treated patients. Teachers inspired children. Barbershops buzzed with conversation. Beauty salons became gathering places where news spread faster than newspapers. Small grocery stores extended credit to struggling families. Newspapers written for African American readers documented stories that larger publications frequently ignored. Entire neighborhoods developed their own economies because exclusion often left few alternatives. Necessity has always been one of history's greatest architects. Yet prosperity remained fragile. Banks often refused loans. Insurance companies discriminated. Housing restrictions confined families to particular neighborhoods. Economic inequality reinforced legal inequality. The two worked together like gears inside an old machine. Quiet, efficient, relentless. Meanwhile, beyond the South, many Americans believed racial discrimination was primarily someone else's problem. Northern cities often lacked formal segregation laws. Yet housing discrimination flourished. Employment discrimination persisted. Schools remained deeply unequal because neighborhoods themselves had become separated. The invisible lines simply looked different. History enjoys changing costumes while keeping remarkably similar scripts. Then came the Second World War. Millions of Americans entered military service. Among them were more than 1 million African Americans. They wore the same uniform, saluted the same flag, risked their lives beneath the same skies. Yet many served in segregated units. Imagine fighting fascism overseas while returning to discrimination at home. One could hardly invent a sharper contradiction. African American newspapers began promoting what became known as the Double V campaign. Victory abroad. Victory at home. Defeat tyranny overseas. Defeat racism in America. The idea resonated deeply. Soldiers who had witnessed Europe, Africa, and the Pacific returned with new expectations. Many had survived artillery, bombers, submarines. They were considerably less interested in being told which water fountain they should use. War changes people, sometimes in ways governments fail to anticipate. Economic change accelerated after the war. Factories expanded. Cities grew. Television entered American living rooms. Cars filled newly constructed highways. The United States projected confidence to the world. Yet beneath that confidence remained unresolved questions. Could a nation truly lead the so-called free world while denying equal rights to millions of its own citizens? During the emerging Cold War, foreign governments asked precisely that question. American leaders noticed. International reputation suddenly mattered. Soviet propaganda eagerly highlighted racial violence in America. Every lynching, every segregated classroom, every attack on peaceful citizens became ammunition in a global ideological struggle. Justice, unexpectedly, acquired geopolitical importance. Not because injustice had become morally worse, but because the world had begun watching more closely. Television transformed everything. Unlike newspapers, television entered people's homes. Viewers could see faces, hear voices, watch events unfold. Images bypassed arguments. A photograph of frightened schoolchildren often persuaded more effectively than pages of political speeches. Soon, that power would reshape the civil rights movement itself. Activists increasingly understood something profound. America could ignore distant suffering. It struggled to ignore suffering broadcast during dinner. But before television captured marches and speeches, before national legislation, before Nobel Prizes, before history books, there remained countless unnamed individuals whose courage never appeared on camera. Teachers quietly encouraging students, parents sacrificing comfort for education, neighbors organizing meetings after long workdays, women preparing meals for gatherings, young people distributing leaflets, pastors opening church doors. Ordinary acts, repeated thousands of times. History often celebrates great leaders, yet movements are usually carried upon invisible shoulders. For every famous speech, someone arranged chairs. For every celebrated march, someone stitched banners. For every headline, countless quiet conversations unfolded around kitchen tables where families weighed impossible decisions. Should we protest? Will we lose our jobs? Will our children be safe? Can anything truly change? Hope rarely arrives fully formed. More often, it begins as a question whispered after midnight. Outside, the seasons continued their endless rhythm. Cotton fields whitened beneath autumn skies. Magnolia blossoms scented spring air. Summer heat shimmered above dusty roads. Winters arrived gently compared with northern states, though cold enough to remind everyone that fireplaces remained useful inventions. Nature appeared blissfully unconcerned with human prejudice. Rain fell upon every roof. The sun warmed every face. Birdsong ignored segregation entirely. Perhaps the natural world quietly offered a lesson humanity had yet to learn. Still, change was approaching. Slowly. Almost invisibly. Like dawn creeping across a dark horizon long before anyone notices the first light. Lawyers were preparing legal challenges. Students were questioning old assumptions. Veterans returned unwilling to accept yesterday's rules. Church leaders strengthened community networks. Journalists sharpened their pens. Parents nurtured children who would soon refuse to accept inherited injustice. The ground beneath American society had begun to shift. Not dramatically. Not yet. History rarely announces its turning points with trumpets. More often, they begin with ordinary people deciding that tomorrow does not have to resemble yesterday. And somewhere, in classrooms separated by color, on buses divided by custom, inside churches filled with determined voices, and around dinner tables where quiet conversations stretched late into the evening. The first steps toward one of the most transformative movements in American history were already being taken. The march toward equality had not yet reached the streets, but it had already begun inside hearts that had grown tired of waiting. And before long, one courtroom decision would crack the foundation of segregation itself, setting in motion events that neither its supporters nor its opponents could fully control. That is where our journey continues. The first cracks in great walls are rarely dramatic. There is no thunder, no trumpet, no convenient narrator standing in the corner announcing, "History is about to happen." Most of the time, someone simply opens a courthouse door on an ordinary morning. Lawyers straighten their jackets. Judges arrange papers. Clerks sharpen pencils. Outside, Traffic continues exactly as it did yesterday. Birds continue singing with complete indifference to constitutional law. And yet, somewhere inside those quiet rooms, entire generations begin changing course. So let us leave the warm southern porches for a moment and travel north to Washington, D.C., where marble buildings stand beneath broad skies, their white columns projecting permanence, as though laws themselves were carved from stone. The Supreme Court of the United States had occupied this solemn place for decades, interpreting a constitution that promised equality while existing alongside a nation that practiced anything but. The contradiction had lingered for generations. Everyone knew it existed. Many simply preferred not to look directly at it. History is surprisingly good at pretending uncomfortable furniture isn't sitting in the middle of the room. For decades, segregation had rested upon a legal foundation built in 1896, when the Supreme Court decided the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Its famous phrase was deceptively simple: separate but equal. Only 3 words. 3 words capable of shaping millions of lives. On paper, the doctrine sounded almost reasonable. If facilities were equal, perhaps separation itself caused no harm. Reality, naturally, had different opinions. The schools were rarely equal. Hospitals were not equal. Libraries, parks, transportation, and public services were almost never equal. Even when buildings appeared similar, something invisible had already been taken away: dignity. No government budget could measure it. No architect could construct it. Yet everyone understood when it was missing. For African American parents, the issue reached far beyond school buildings. Imagine watching your child walk into a classroom already carrying the quiet message that society considered them less worthy than another child only a few miles away. No textbook could erase that lesson. No fresh coat of paint could disguise it. The deepest injury was psychological. Children notice fairness long before they understand politics. They know instinctively when something feels wrong. And children ask difficult questions. Why can't I go there? Why is that school bigger? Why do they have new books? Parents answered as gently as they could. Sometimes honestly. Sometimes carefully. Sometimes with silence, because certain truths are painfully difficult to explain. Fortunately, or perhaps inevitably, some adults decided silence had lasted long enough. Among them was an organization that had spent decades preparing for precisely this moment: the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, better known simply as the NAACP. Its lawyers believed segregation could be defeated not only through protests, but also through carefully chosen court cases. This required extraordinary patience, years of research, countless legal briefs, strategic planning that unfolded one case at a time. History often celebrates dramatic speeches. Lawyers, meanwhile, changed the world one footnote at a time. One of the NAACP's brightest legal minds was a quiet, brilliant attorney named Thurgood Marshall. He possessed neither the booming theatrical voice of a preacher nor the commanding image of a military general. His battlefield was language. His weapon was constitutional law. Marshall understood something essential. If segregation could be shown to violate the Constitution itself, then the legal foundations supporting Jim Crow might begin collapsing. Not overnight. Laws rarely surrender that easily, but foundations matter. Remove enough stones, and eventually even the tallest walls begin leaning. The case that would become Brown versus Board of Education actually combined several lawsuits from different states. Each involved families seeking something astonishingly modest. Their children simply wanted equal access to education. No revolutions. No impossible demands. Just the opportunity to attend nearby public schools. One family lived in Topeka, Kansas. That alone surprises many people. Segregation is often imagined as exclusively Southern. Yet discrimination stretched across much of America in different forms. The Brown family became one of several whose names entered legal history almost by chance. Little Linda Brown was only a child. Each morning she walked through railroad yards and across busy streets to reach her assigned black elementary school. A white school stood much closer to her home. She could almost see it. Almost. Distance has a peculiar way of becoming symbolic. Sometimes only a few blocks separate entirely different worlds. Her father, Oliver Brown, wondered a question many parents might ask. Why should his daughter travel farther simply because of her race? The answer offered by local authorities was straightforward. Because the law said so. History has repeatedly demonstrated that legality and justice are distant cousins at best. The lawsuits slowly advanced through lower courts. Appeals followed. Months became years. Legal documents accumulated into towering stacks of paper. Arguments grew increasingly sophisticated. Meanwhile, children continued growing older. Life does not pause while judges deliberate. Finally, in December 1952, attorneys presented their arguments before the Supreme Court. The courtroom itself remained dignified and restrained. No shouting. No cheering crowds. No dramatic orchestral soundtrack, despite what certain films might suggest. 9 justices listened carefully as lawyers debated constitutional principles that would influence generations yet unborn. One key question emerged. Did segregation itself cause harm, even if buildings appeared similar? Psychologists presented research suggesting that segregated education damaged children's sense of self-worth. One famous study involved dolls. Black children were shown identical dolls differing only in skin color. Many associated the white dolls with positive qualities while assigning negative traits to the black dolls. The findings were heartbreaking. Imagine living in a society so saturated with inequality that children begin believing the prejudice directed toward them. Bias had become internalized. The system did not merely separate bodies. It reached minds. Chief Justice Earl Warren understood the enormous significance of the decision before the court. He also recognized another challenge. A divided court might weaken public acceptance. He worked patiently to build consensus among the justices. Compromise behind closed doors became almost as important as legal reasoning itself. Sometimes history depends less upon fiery speeches than upon remarkably polite conversations around conference tables. Then came the morning of May 17, 1954. Spring sunlight illuminated Washington. Flowers bloomed. People hurried through ordinary routines without realizing the day would soon occupy history textbooks around the world. Inside the Supreme Court, spectators filled the chamber. Lawyers waited. Journalists prepared notebooks. Silence settled. Chief Justice Warren began reading. His voice remained calm, measured, almost gentle. Yet every sentence carried enormous weight. We conclude. The words echoed softly through the room, that in the field of public education the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. No place. Simple words. Profound consequences. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Inherently. Not poorly managed. Not temporarily unequal. Not accidentally unfair. Unequal by their very nature. The legal cornerstone supporting school segregation had just cracked. Across America, reactions arrived almost immediately. Many African American families celebrated. Church bells rang. Neighbors embraced. Newspapers printed triumphant headlines. Hope spread carefully, like sunlight entering a room whose curtains had remained closed for decades. Yet celebration quickly met reality. Court decisions can change laws. They do not instantly change hearts, nor habits, nor politics, nor prejudice. Those usually require considerably more stubborn work. In parts of the South, resistance emerged with astonishing speed. Some politicians denounced the ruling. Others promised to ignore it. A few proposed closing public schools entirely rather than integrating them, because apparently educating no children seemed preferable to educating all children together. History occasionally reaches levels of pettiness that almost defy imagination. State governments searched desperately for legal loopholes. School boards delayed compliance. Local officials invented new bureaucratic obstacles. The court later instructed integration to proceed with all deliberate speed. The phrase sounded sensible. Unfortunately, many opponents focused enthusiastically on the word deliberate. Some interpreted it as permission to move at approximately the pace of continental drift. Years passed. In many communities, nothing changed. Children still entered separate buildings, separate classrooms, separate futures. Meanwhile, civil rights leaders studied the decision carefully. Brown had accomplished something extraordinary. It proved the legal system could produce victories. The Constitution could, under certain circumstances, become an ally rather than an obstacle. But it also revealed an uncomfortable truth. Winning in court did not guarantee change on the street. The law could open doors. Someone still had to walk through them. And that walk could be frightening. Teachers worried about losing their jobs. Parents feared violence. Children carried burdens no child should bear. Imagine being 8 years old and discovering that your daily trip to school had become national news. Every adult around you argued over whether you belonged in a classroom. Not because of grades. Not because of behavior. Simply because of your skin. History can ask impossible things of children. Yet children often display astonishing courage. Across Black communities, conversations shifted. If schools could be challenged. What about buses? Restaurants? Libraries? Voting restrictions? Perhaps segregation itself was not as permanent as it had once seemed. Hope, once awakened, develops an inconvenient habit. It refuses to return quietly to sleep. Church meetings grew larger. Community leaders exchanged ideas. College students listened closely. Young ministers began imagining broader campaigns. Older activists who had labored quietly for decades sensed that history itself was accelerating. The movement still lacked a single defining moment. No towering national figure had yet emerged to unite millions. That would come soon enough. For now, change gathered quietly beneath the surface, like pressure building beneath frozen ground before the first days of spring. And hundreds of miles away, in the city of Montgomery, Alabama, a seamstress who had spent years working, praying, and quietly organizing was about to finish another ordinary day at work. She was tired. Her feet hurt. The bus ride home awaited. She could not know that the simple act of remaining seated would soon alter the course of American history. Sometimes revolutions begin not with shouting, but with someone deciding they have stood long enough. Evening settled slowly over Montgomery. The Alabama sun, fierce through most of the afternoon, finally surrendered to softer shades of amber and violet. Long shadows stretched across brick storefronts and quiet neighborhoods. The day's heat lingered in the pavement, rising gently into the cooling air, while cicadas performed the nightly concert they had apparently been rehearsing for millions of years. Streetlights flickered awake one by one. Cars rolled past barbershops closing for the evening. Children chased one another across front yards until mothers called them inside. Storekeepers swept dust from sidewalks. Nothing about December 1st, 1955, appeared extraordinary. History, once again, was wearing the disguise of an ordinary Thursday. Montgomery was a city built upon routine. Every morning, thousands of African Americans boarded city buses on their way to work. Housekeepers traveled to neighborhoods where they cleaned homes they could not afford. Janitors unlocked office buildings before dawn. Teachers carried stacks of papers beneath one arm. Factory workers rubbed sleep from tired eyes as buses rattled over familiar streets. The buses themselves reflected the city's racial order. White passengers entered through the front door, paid their fare, and sat wherever they pleased. Black passengers also entered through the front. But after paying, they were often expected to step back onto the sidewalk and re-enter through the rear door before taking a seat. Sometimes the driver pulled away before they could climb back aboard. Imagine paying for a service, only to watch it disappear down the street without you. It happened often enough that many passengers simply accepted it as another small humiliation among countless others. The seating arrangement inside followed equally complicated rules. The front rows belonged exclusively to white passengers. The rear rows were designated for black passengers. Between them sat a movable dividing sign. When white riders filled the front section, the driver could move the sign farther back, requiring black passengers to surrender additional seats. Not because the bus lacked space, because custom demanded it. The sign itself was almost laughably ordinary. Just a small board. Metal frame. Printed words. Yet that little piece of metal carried astonishing authority. Objects possess no power on their own. People grant them power. And once granted, power can become surprisingly difficult to reclaim. Montgomery's bus drivers enforced these rules with varying degrees of courtesy. Some remained polite. Others appeared to treat cruelty as a competitive sport. One driver in particular had already crossed paths with a quiet woman named Rosa Parks years earlier. His name was James Blake. Back in 1943, Parks had boarded his bus, paid her fare, and stepped outside to re-enter through the rear door as required. Before she could climb aboard, Blake drove away, leaving her standing in the rain. One imagines that did little to improve customer satisfaction. Neither forgot the encounter. Years passed. Life continued. Rosa Parks worked as a seamstress. She mended clothing with careful hands accustomed to patience. Needle, thread, fabric. Small stitches repeated thousands of times. Perhaps there is something symbolic about that. Great social movements, after all, are often sewn together one careful stitch at a time. To outsiders, Parks appeared remarkably ordinary. Soft-spoken, calm, reserved. History would later paint her as someone who simply became too tired to stand after work. That version is comforting. It is also incomplete. Yes, she was physically tired. Anyone working long hours would be. But Rosa Parks was something more. She had served as secretary of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP for years. She investigated racial violence, recorded testimonies, helped organize legal efforts. She attended workshops on civil rights. She understood exactly how segregation operated. Her decision would not emerge from sudden frustration. It would emerge from years of quiet conviction. Courage is rarely spontaneous. Usually, it has been practicing in silence for a very long time. As evening approached on December 1st, Parks boarded Cleveland Avenue bus number 2857. She paid her fare, found a seat in the first row of the section reserved for black passengers. Outside, darkness slowly gathered. Passengers climbed aboard at each stop. Workers returning home. Shoppers carrying paper bags. Teenagers laughing quietly among themselves. The bus filled steadily. Eventually, the white section reached capacity. A white man remained standing. Driver James Blake glanced into his mirror. Then he performed the familiar ritual. He moved the dividing sign back. He instructed 4 black passengers to surrender their row. 3 stood reluctantly. 1 remained seated. Rosa Parks. The conversation itself lasted only moments. Are you going to stand? No. Just one syllable. No. History sometimes turns on astonishingly small words. Parks would later explain that she was not physically incapable of standing. She was tired. Not of work. Not of walking. She was tired of giving in. There is an important distinction. Blake threatened to call the police. Parks answered quietly. You may do that. No shouting. No dramatic speech. No raised fist. Just calm certainty. Perhaps that composure unsettled him more than anger would have. Police officers soon arrived. They arrested Rosa Parks for violating the city's segregation ordinance. Imagine explaining such an arrest to future generations. What exactly was the crime? Remaining seated. History occasionally produces sentences so absurd they almost collapse under their own weight. Parks was taken to jail. Fingerprinted. Booked. Released later on bail. Word spread quickly through Montgomery's black community. Church telephones rang late into the night. Neighbors knocked on doors. Friends whispered across front porches. Local activist E.D. Nixon immediately recognized the opportunity. For years, community leaders had discussed challenging bus segregation. Previous incidents had occurred. Other women had resisted. Some cases proved legally complicated. Others lacked organizational support. This time felt different. Parks possessed an impeccable reputation. Respected. Responsible. Steady. If anyone could become the face of a legal challenge, many believed it was her. But legal action alone would not be enough. Someone proposed something bolder. What if black residents simply stopped riding the buses? The idea sounded almost impossible. After all, African Americans made up roughly 3/4 of Montgomery's bus riders. The buses depended heavily upon their fares. If thousands refused to ride, the system might actually feel the consequences. It was an audacious gamble. It also required extraordinary discipline. The boycott was scheduled to begin on Monday, December 5th. That left only a few days. No social media. No text messages. No email. Not even photocopiers in widespread community use. Organizers relied on telephones, mimeograph machines, churches, schools, and an astonishing amount of walking. Volunteers worked through the night producing thousands of leaflets. Simple messages. Don't ride the bus Monday. Tell your neighbors. Spread the word. Sometimes revolutions are printed with purple ink on inexpensive paper. Sunday churches became communication centers. Pastors announced the plan from pulpits. Congregations carried the message home. Families repeated it to friends. Shopkeepers mentioned it to customers. Barbers told clients. Teachers quietly informed trusted parents. An entire network awakened almost overnight. One might almost compare it to roots beneath a forest floor. Invisible until suddenly the whole woodland seems connected. Then Monday arrived. Before sunrise, Montgomery stirred to life. Bus drivers prepared their routes. Engines coughed into motion. Doors folded open. Drivers expected another ordinary workday. Instead, something remarkable happened. The buses were nearly empty. Not completely, but astonishingly quiet. Meanwhile, sidewalks filled with people. Men wearing polished shoes walked miles to work. Women carrying lunch pails crossed the city on foot. Domestic workers left home before dawn. Students walked together beneath crisp December skies. Some traveled 10 miles in a single day. Imagine that. 10 miles. Not for recreation. Not for fitness. Simply because dignity had become worth more than convenience. Rain fell occasionally. Cold mornings arrived. Feet blistered. Legs ached. Still they walked. Black-owned taxi companies helped by charging the same fare as bus tickets whenever possible. Churches organized carpools. Volunteers offered rides. Mechanics repaired vehicles free of charge. Families adjusted schedules. Neighbors helped neighbors. An entire community quietly reinvented transportation. The boycott succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Local newspapers noticed. National reporters soon followed. Television crews arrived. America began watching Montgomery. The city had unexpectedly become the center of a growing movement. That evening, thousands gathered at Holt Street Baptist Church. People packed every pew. Others stood outside listening through open windows. The atmosphere vibrated with anticipation. Voices filled the sanctuary. Old hymns rose toward the ceiling. Prayers echoed softly. Then organizers introduced a relatively young minister who had lived in Montgomery for barely a year. He was only 26 years old. Many outside his congregation had never heard his name. Martin Luther King Jr. He approached the pulpit without knowing that history had quietly placed him at its center. His voice began calmly, then gathered strength. He spoke not of revenge, not of hatred, not of humiliation. He spoke of justice, of love, of constitutional rights, of human dignity. "We are here," he declared, "because we are determined to be free." The audience erupted. Not because freedom had arrived, because someone had finally given voice to what so many already carried within themselves. King possessed extraordinary gifts. His words blended theology, philosophy, history, and everyday experience into something both poetic and practical. He could sound like an Old Testament prophet one moment and a thoughtful neighbor the next. Most importantly, he insisted upon nonviolence. Not because violence was impossible, because he believed violence ultimately corrupted both victim and oppressor. It was an astonishingly demanding philosophy. To refuse hatred while facing hatred. To answer cruelty with discipline. To meet fists with dignity. It sounded almost impossible. Many wondered whether it could actually work. The months ahead would provide the answer. The boycott continued. 1 week became 2. 2 became 6. Winter slowly gave way to spring. The buses kept running. Their seats remained conspicuously empty. City officials grew increasingly frustrated. Some attempted legal pressure. Others threatened organizers. King's home was bombed while his wife and infant daughter were inside. Miraculously, they survived. An angry crowd gathered outside. Some carried weapons. Tension filled the night air. Many feared violence would erupt. King stepped onto his damaged porch. He urged everyone to go home peacefully. "We must love our enemies. Imagine saying those words while broken glass still covered your living room floor. Whether one agrees with his philosophy or not, the discipline required is difficult to overstate. The boycott would ultimately last 381 days, nearly 13 months, long enough for shoes to wear thin, long enough for routines to become traditions, long enough for determination to become habit. Finally, in November 1956, the Supreme Court affirmed that segregation on Montgomery's buses violated the Constitution. The boycott ended in victory. On December 21st, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and countless ordinary citizens boarded integrated buses. The seats looked exactly the same as before. The windows had not changed. The engines still rattled. Yet everything was different. Sometimes history alters the meaning of ordinary objects forever. A bus seat became more than a seat. It became proof that ordinary people, walking together with extraordinary patience, could bend history itself. And as word of Montgomery's victory spread across America, students, ministers, teachers, and young activists began asking a dangerous question. If one city could change, why not another? The movement was no longer a local protest. It had become a national awakening, and the next chapter would belong not to ministers alone, but to children brave enough to walk through school doors that an entire nation was watching. Victory has a curious habit. It rarely arrives alone. It brings celebration, certainly, relief, a few tears, songs sung a little louder than before. But it also brings attention. And attention, as countless people throughout history have discovered, is both a blessing and a burden. After the Montgomery bus boycott ended in triumph, newspapers across the United States carried photographs of smiling passengers boarding newly integrated buses. Editorial writers debated the future of the South. Politicians suddenly discovered that civil rights could no longer be treated as a local inconvenience tucked safely behind state borders. The rest of the world was watching. During the Cold War, American officials often spoke proudly about democracy and freedom. Radio broadcasts traveled across Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, describing the United States as the great defender of liberty. Yet foreign journalists had also watched police arrest peaceful protesters for sitting in bus seats. One message became increasingly difficult to reconcile with the other. History has an inconvenient tendency to ask people whether they truly mean the ideals they proclaim. Martin Luther King Jr., meanwhile, found that life had changed almost overnight. A year earlier, he had been a relatively unknown pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Now letters arrived by the hundreds, then the thousands. Invitations poured in from churches, universities, labor organizations, and civic groups. Some praised him. Others threatened to kill him. The mail became a strange mixture of encouragement and hatred. Hope and fear often travel together. King was only 27 years old. Imagine carrying the expectations of millions before reaching 30. There are days when most of us struggle simply to answer a few emails. History occasionally assigns rather heavier workloads. Yet King understood something essential. Montgomery had not been the end. It had merely proven that organized, disciplined, nonviolent resistance could succeed. Now the question became how to expand that success across an entire nation. In January 1957, dozens of ministers and community leaders gathered in Atlanta. The atmosphere felt optimistic, though cautious. Coffee cups rested beside legal papers. Typewriters clicked in nearby rooms. Ideas filled the air almost as quickly as cigarette smoke, which, in fairness, seemed to accompany nearly every meeting of the mid-20th century. Doctors today would probably have objected rather strongly. The gathering produced a new organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The name sounded formal, almost bureaucratic, as though it might spend its days filing reports in particularly well-organized cabinets. Instead, the SCLC would become one of the most influential organizations of the civil rights movement. Its mission extended beyond buses. It sought to challenge segregation throughout the South using churches as the movement's backbone. This made practical sense. Churches already possessed buildings, meeting spaces, communication networks, trusted leaders. Most importantly, they possessed communities willing to support one another during difficult times. Faith and activism became deeply intertwined. Prayer meetings often transformed seamlessly into planning sessions. Hymns became songs of resistance. Sunday sermons quietly prepared people for Monday demonstrations. Not everyone approved. Some argued that religion should remain separate from politics. Others responded that demanding justice for one's neighbor had always been part of faith. The debate continues in many forms even today. History rarely settles every argument. While adults organized conferences and delivered speeches, another battle unfolded hundreds of miles away in Little Rock, Arkansas. Unlike Montgomery, this conflict centered upon children. Specifically, 9 teenagers. 9 ordinary students who wanted something astonishingly simple: to attend high school. That sentence sounds almost laughably ordinary now. At the time, it required extraordinary courage. Following the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education, public schools were legally required to integrate. Legally. Reality remained considerably more complicated. Many school districts delayed implementation. Others resisted openly. Some simply hoped the issue would disappear if ignored long enough. Spoiler alert. It did not. Little Rock's Central High School stood like an enormous castle of education. Its Gothic architecture featured tall windows, broad staircases, and elegant stone walls. Inside were modern science laboratories, large classrooms, athletic facilities, an impressive library. It represented opportunity, at least for white students. The Little Rock School Board eventually announced a gradual plan for integration. 9 African American students were selected to attend. They became known forever as the Little Rock 9. Imagine receiving that news. Congratulations. You've been accepted into a prestigious school. Also, an entire nation will soon argue about your existence. No teenager deserves homework quite like that. Among the students was 15-year-old Elizabeth Eckford. Quiet. Intelligent. Reserved. On the morning of September 4th, 1957, she dressed carefully. White blouse. Dark skirt. Books held tightly against her chest. She expected to meet the other students. A misunderstanding prevented it. Instead, she arrived alone. Sometimes history can be astonishingly cruel in its timing. As Elizabeth approached Central High, she saw soldiers surrounding the building. Not foreign invaders. Not enemy troops. The Arkansas National Guard. Governor Orville Faubus had ordered them to prevent integration. Officially, he claimed they were preserving peace. In practice, they blocked black students from entering school. Elizabeth walked toward the entrance anyway. A soldier lowered his rifle, not to fire, simply to block her path. He shook his head. She could not enter. Behind her, an angry crowd gathered. People shouted. Some screamed insults. Others demanded she leave. Faces twisted with rage. Adults yelled at a 15-year-old girl carrying school books. Imagine that scene. Imagine waking up expecting algebra. Instead, you become surrounded by hundreds of furious strangers. Elizabeth remained astonishingly composed. She turned away. The crowd followed. Journalists captured every moment. One photograph became iconic. Elizabeth walks alone. Dark sunglasses hide her eyes. Books clutched tightly. Behind her, a young white woman screams hatred with astonishing intensity. The contrast remains heartbreaking decades later. Calm dignity walking through a storm of fury. Eventually, Elizabeth reached a bus stop. She sat quietly, still surrounded by threats. A white woman named Grace Lorch approached her. Lorch and her husband escorted Elizabeth safely onto a city bus. One act of simple human kindness. History remembers such moments too. The photograph traveled around the world. Millions saw it. Many asked the same question. How could a child be treated this way? Television possessed extraordinary power. People who might never read legal opinions or political speeches could understand a frightened teenager. Emotion often reaches places that arguments cannot. President Dwight D. Eisenhower watched events unfold with growing concern. Eisenhower had not sought confrontation with Southern governors. He preferred gradual solutions, quiet negotiation, measured responses. Little Rock left him few choices. If a state governor could openly defy the Supreme Court, what happened to the rule of law? The issue extended beyond education. It became a constitutional crisis. After failed negotiations, Eisenhower made an extraordinary decision. He federalized the Arkansas National Guard, removing it from the governor's control. Then he sent soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock, the same division that had fought across Europe during World War II. Now American paratroopers escorted American children into an American school. History occasionally constructs sentences so remarkable they hardly seem real. On September 25th, under armed military protection, the Little Rock Nine entered Central High School. No cheering crowds welcomed them. Inside, the challenges continued. Students shoved them in hallways, whispered threats, threw objects, excluded them from activities. Teachers varied widely in their responses. Some offered quiet support. Others looked away. Imagine enduring that every day, not for a week, not for a month, an entire school year. The students displayed astonishing endurance. Every morning they returned. Every afternoon they survived another day. Courage, it turns out, is often repetitive. It wakes up early, gets dressed, carries books, shows up again tomorrow. One student, Ernest Green, eventually became the first African-American graduate of Central High School. His graduation represented far more than a diploma. It symbolized persistence. Sometimes victory is not dramatic. Sometimes victory is simply refusing to quit. Across America, young people watched Little Rock carefully, especially college students. They admired King's speeches, respected court victories, but many felt impatient. They had grown up beneath segregation. They were tired of waiting for older generations to negotiate every inch of progress. Youth possesses remarkable qualities: energy, optimism, occasional recklessness. History generally requires all three. On February 1st, 1960, 4 freshmen from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College entered a Woolworth department store in Greensboro, North Carolina. Their names were Ezell Blair Jr., David Richmond, Franklin McCain, and Joseph McNeil. They purchased ordinary items: toothpaste, school supplies, small purchases. Then they sat down at the lunch counter. The counter served white customers only. The students politely requested coffee. The waitress declined. Store policy. They remained seated. No shouting. No threats. No violence. Simply sitting. One of the simplest human activities imaginable. Yet within segregation, even sitting became revolutionary. The store closed. The students left peacefully. The next morning, they returned. This time with more students. Then more. Within days, dozens participated. Within weeks, hundreds. Within months, thousands of young people across the South organized similar sit-ins. The movement spread with astonishing speed, like ripples across still water, or perhaps like the first birds beginning to sing before sunrise. Each one alone seemed small. Together, they announced the coming of a new day. The sit-ins spread the way spring sometimes arrives. Not all at once. Not with some great trumpet blast that wakes the entire countryside in a single morning. Instead, almost imperceptibly, one blossom opens, then another. A few birds return. The mornings become just a little less cold. And one day, without quite knowing when it happened, the landscape has changed. That was how the sit-in movement unfolded across America. Greensboro inspired Nashville. Nashville inspired Atlanta. Atlanta inspired Richmond. Richmond inspired dozens of smaller towns whose names rarely appear in documentaries, though history owes them no less gratitude. Students watched newspaper photographs over breakfast. They listened to radio reports between classes. They passed around magazine articles inside dormitories. Then someone would eventually ask the dangerous question: why not here? History has always depended upon those three words. Inside department stores throughout the South, lunch counters had become symbols of segregation. To modern eyes, they appear surprisingly ordinary. Long polished countertops, chrome stools bolted to the floor, coffee machines hissing softly, waitresses carrying plates of sandwiches and slices of pie, the smell of fresh coffee mixed with grilled hamburgers and vanilla milkshakes. perfectly ordinary places, unless you happen to have been born with the wrong skin color. African Americans could often spend money inside these same stores. They could purchase clothing, shoes, books, household supplies. The stores welcomed their dollars quite enthusiastically, but when lunchtime arrived, they were expected to leave. Apparently, money could cross racial boundaries. Sandwiches could not. History sometimes invents rules so illogical that even those enforcing them struggle to explain why they exist. The students understood something profound. By sitting quietly, they exposed the absurdity of segregation without needing lengthy speeches. A polite request for a cup of coffee became impossible to ignore. If denied service, everyone watching could plainly see what discrimination looked like. No complicated legal arguments required. Just an empty stool, a patient student, a refused meal. Sometimes the simplest images become the most powerful. But sitting peacefully did not guarantee peaceful treatment. Quite the opposite. White customers often responded with anger. Some shouted insults. Others pushed students from their seats. Food was dumped over carefully pressed clothing. Hot coffee occasionally followed. Cigarette smoke was blown directly into faces. Ketchup, mustard, sugar, salt. Anything within reach sometimes became a weapon of humiliation. Imagine sitting perfectly still while someone pours an entire milkshake over your head. Every instinct tells you to react, to stand, to argue, perhaps even to fight. Instead, the students remained seated. This required astonishing discipline. Nonviolence is frequently misunderstood as passivity. In reality, it often demands extraordinary self-control. Anyone can lose their temper, remaining calm while another human being deliberately humiliates you. That is considerably harder. To prepare, many student groups underwent training sessions. Role-playing exercises became common. One volunteer pretended to be an angry customer. Another played the demonstrator. Insults flew across church basements. Not because anyone enjoyed them, because participants needed practice. What happens if someone spits on you? What if they hit you? What if they drag you outside? The questions were painfully practical. Volunteers rehearsed keeping their hands folded, keeping eye contact, keeping their voices steady. History occasionally resembles theater, except the consequences are painfully real. One city, however, would transform this philosophy into something approaching an art form. Nashville, Tennessee. Unlike many southern cities, Nashville possessed a remarkable network of student leaders. Young men and women from colleges throughout the city gathered regularly for workshops led by a minister named James Lawson. Lawson had studied the philosophy of nonviolent resistance in India. He admired the work of Mahatma Gandhi and believed similar methods could challenge segregation in America. His classes were unlike ordinary lectures. Students did not merely discuss ethics. They practiced courage. Week after week, month after month. Among Lawson's students sat individuals whose names would later become famous. John Lewis. Quiet. Thoughtful. Almost painfully shy at first. He had grown up on an Alabama farm preaching sermons to chickens. Yes, chickens. History occasionally rewards the most unlikely apprenticeships. Young John would gather the family's chickens together and deliver miniature sermons because they made remarkably patient congregations. Unlike some humans, they rarely interrupted. Years later, he would smile at the memory. At the time, however, he simply loved speaking about justice. Another student was Diane Nash. Confident, intelligent, determined. She had grown up in Chicago and arrived in Nashville expecting segregation to be little more than an unpleasant regional custom. Experiencing it firsthand shocked her. She later admitted that the irrationality of segregation disturbed her almost as much as its cruelty. The rules simply made no sense. Why should one person receive service while another did not? No satisfactory answer ever appeared. Only habit. And habit, history repeatedly demonstrates, can become one of the strongest prisons. The Nashville students organized their demonstrations with remarkable precision. They dressed formally. Young men wore jackets and ties. Young women wore dresses, hair neatly arranged, shoes polished. Not because appearance determined moral worth, but because they understood the power of public perception. Photographs showing neatly dressed students calmly enduring violence would tell a compelling story. Presentation became strategy. There is something quietly fascinating about this. The movement fought against superficial judgments while simultaneously understanding how appearances influenced public opinion. History is rarely free from irony. The demonstrations intensified. Lunch counters filled with silent protesters. Police arrested students for trespassing. Television cameras arrived. Reporters scribbled notes. City officials grew increasingly uncomfortable. Business owners discovered something unpleasant. Bad publicity discouraged customers. Segregation was proving expensive. Commerce possesses curious moral instincts. Sometimes profit notices injustice before politics does. Then tragedy struck elsewhere. On April 19, 1960, the Nashville home of attorney Alexander Luby, who represented many arrested students, was bombed before dawn. Fortunately, Luby and his wife survived. The explosion shattered windows across the neighborhood. The blast awakened an entire city. Later that day, thousands of silent protesters marched peacefully to City Hall. No shouting. No signs. Only footsteps echoing through Nashville streets. Silence, under the right circumstances, can become thunderously loud. Mayor Ben West eventually met representatives of the march. One reporter asked him a simple question. Do you think it is wrong to discriminate against a person solely because of race or color? The mayor hesitated. Thousands waited. Finally, yes. Just one word. Yes. Small words have changed history before. They would again. Within weeks, Nashville became the first major southern city to begin desegregating its downtown lunch counters. The students had succeeded, not through violence, not through threats, but through relentless dignity. Success inspired broader ambitions. Young activists began asking another question. If lunch counters could be integrated, what about interstate travel? Federal law already prohibited segregation on buses traveling between states, at least on paper. Reality, predictably, remained somewhat less cooperative. Bus terminals across the South frequently ignored federal rulings. Separate waiting rooms remained. Separate restaurants. Separate restrooms. Separate ticket counters. The law existed. Enforcement did not. Once again, ordinary citizens decided to test reality. An interracial group organized a journey through the Deep South. Black and white passengers would travel together on interstate buses. They would deliberately use integrated seating, integrated waiting rooms, integrated facilities, not to provoke violence, but to reveal whether federal law truly meant anything. The journey became known as the Freedom Rides. It began on May 4, 1961. 7 black riders, 6 white riders. Young, idealistic. Some scarcely older than college freshmen. They packed suitcases much like any travelers. Extra clothes, toothbrushes, books. Perhaps a little nervous excitement. Though one suspects most ordinary vacations involve considerably fewer discussions about potential mob violence. The riders knew the risks. They signed wills. Some wrote farewell letters. Others quietly informed family members that they might not return. Imagine boarding a bus with that knowledge resting quietly inside your suitcase. Their route would carry them from Washington, D.C., through Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and finally New Orleans. It looked straightforward on a map. Maps rarely include hatred. At first, the rides proceeded with relatively minor incidents. Hostile stares. Harsh words. Occasional arrests. Then they reached Alabama. Outside the town of Anniston, a white mob attacked one of the buses. Its tires had been slashed earlier. The damaged bus struggled along the highway before finally stopping. The crowd surrounded it. Windows shattered. Someone threw a firebomb through the door. Smoke poured into the cabin. Flames spread rapidly. Passengers struggled to breathe. For a horrifying moment, it appeared they might all die inside. Only when the fuel tank threatened to explode did the attackers retreat long enough for passengers to escape. Even then, some fleeing riders were beaten. Photographs of the burned Greyhound bus raced around the world. Twisted metal, blackened windows, smoke rising into Alabama skies. The image became unforgettable. One bus, completely destroyed. Yet somehow, the movement itself emerged stronger. Violence intended to frighten activists instead exposed segregation's brutality more clearly than ever before. The freedom rides would continue, because by now, hundreds of young people understood something that frightened defenders of segregation more than any single protest. Courage, like hope, can be contagious. And in the months ahead, that courage would carry thousands into some of the most dangerous confrontations the movement had yet faced. The burned bus still smoked long after the crowd had dispersed. Its metal frame twisted beneath the Alabama sun, blackened windows staring blankly toward an empty highway. The smell lingered, a mixture of scorched rubber, burned upholstery, spilled gasoline, and smoke that seemed determined to cling to everything nearby. Fire leaves behind an unusual silence. Not the peaceful silence of a sleeping countryside. A heavier silence. One that settles after violence has exhausted itself. Newspaper photographers walked carefully around the wreckage, adjusting lenses and changing rolls of film. They understood they were documenting more than a destroyed vehicle. They were photographing an argument. One side claimed segregation preserved order. The other had just watched that order attempt to burn human beings alive. The images would soon appear across the world. Sometimes a single photograph can dismantle decades of carefully constructed excuses. The freedom riders themselves were shaken, bruised, exhausted. Some sat quietly in hospitals while nurses cleaned cuts from shattered glass. Others telephoned worried families. Many had experienced violence before. Few had expected quite this level of organized hatred. The attacks continued. In Birmingham, Alabama, another mob waited. Not spontaneously, carefully arranged. Later investigations suggested that local authorities had effectively granted attackers several uninterrupted minutes before police would intervene. One might politely describe that as an exceptionally flexible interpretation of public safety. The riders stepped from their bus. Almost immediately, fists began flying. Iron pipes, chains, baseball bats. Journalists were beaten. Photographers attacked. Even white bystanders attempting to help occasionally found themselves targeted. Violence, once unleashed, has remarkably poor aim. Among those assaulted was a young activist named Jim Peck. He suffered severe head injuries requiring dozens of stitches. Photographs taken afterward showed blood covering his face. The images appeared in newspapers across Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The United States had hoped to present itself as the leader of the free world. Instead, millions now saw peaceful travelers beaten for sitting together on a bus. Diplomats quietly worried. Foreign governments asked uncomfortable questions. American officials discovered that civil rights had become not only a moral issue, but an international one. For a brief moment, it appeared the freedom rides might end. Several buses had been attacked. Passengers injured. Transportation companies hesitated to continue. Government officials quietly suggested postponement. It would have been an understandable decision. No reasonable person would fault someone for avoiding another beating. Yet something remarkable happened. College students in Nashville watched the news and reached a conclusion. If violence stopped the rides, violence would have won. That was unacceptable. Among those reaching this conclusion was Diane Nash. Barely in her 20s, she calmly informed nervous officials that new volunteers were already on their way. When someone warned her that they might be killed, she answered with astonishing composure. "We all signed our wills." Imagine speaking those words before most people today have even chosen a career. History occasionally entrusts extraordinary responsibilities to extraordinarily young people. The replacement riders boarded buses heading south, one group after another. When arrests removed them, new volunteers arrived. When jails filled, more came. The movement had discovered one of its greatest strengths. Leadership could be arrested. Ideas could not. Eventually, the riders reached Jackson, Mississippi. There, authorities adopted a different strategy. Instead of allowing violent mobs to attack protesters before cameras, police simply arrested nearly everyone almost immediately. The charges were usually breach of peace. A curious accusation. The demonstrators had entered quietly, purchased tickets, sat peacefully. Apparently, peace itself had become rather controversial. The jails filled rapidly. When local facilities overflowed, prisoners were transferred to the Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman Farm. Even the name sounded ominous. Parchman had a long, grim history. Rows of prison buildings stood surrounded by fields beneath the relentless Mississippi sun. Barbed wire shimmered above tall fences. Guard towers watched silently across the grounds. Inside, Freedom Riders attempted to maintain morale. They sang. Old spirituals echoed through concrete hallways. We shall overcome. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Voices carried from cell to cell. Guards sometimes confiscated mattresses, turned on fans during cold weather, removed personal belongings. The singing continued. Music became resistance. Again. History had seen this pattern before. Whenever authorities attempted to silence the movement, songs somehow grew louder. Perhaps because songs require remarkably little equipment. No printing presses. No microphones. Only breath. And hope. While the Freedom Riders endured arrests across Mississippi, another important development quietly unfolded behind government office doors in Washington. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy found himself navigating an increasingly difficult situation. Kennedy believed in enforcing federal law. He also worried about escalating violence. Balancing justice with political reality proved exhausting. Civil rights leaders frequently criticized the federal government for moving too slowly. Southern politicians accused it of moving too quickly. One imagines that satisfying both sides simultaneously was never especially likely. Still, the pressure produced results. The Interstate Commerce Commission finally issued stronger regulations banning segregation in interstate bus terminals. The order required integrated waiting rooms, integrated restrooms, integrated lunch counters, integrated seating. Most importantly, it required enforcement. Rules without enforcement resemble umbrellas full of holes. Technically present, not especially useful. On November 1st, 1961, the new regulations took effect. Across much of the South, old, white, and colored signs quietly disappeared. Some were removed reluctantly. Others vanished overnight. Workers unscrewed bolts from walls where those signs had hung for decades. One wonders whether they paused for even a moment. Whether anyone looked at the faded paint beneath the metal and realized they were watching one chapter of history literally come off the wall. Yet victories often revealed deeper challenges. Ending segregation in bus terminals did not end segregation everywhere else. Schools remained battlegrounds. Voting rights remained severely restricted. Economic inequality persisted. Violence continued. The movement had climbed one hill only to discover an entire mountain range waiting beyond it. And perhaps no place demonstrated that more clearly than Albany, Georgia. In late 1961, local activists there launched a broad campaign challenging segregation throughout the city. Unlike Montgomery, the protests targeted many institutions simultaneously. Libraries, parks, transportation, restaurants, government buildings. The movement hoped that confronting the entire system at once would produce sweeping change. Martin Luther King Jr. arrived to lend support. The demonstrations attracted national attention. Hundreds were arrested. King himself spent time in jail. Yet Albany produced frustratingly few immediate victories. Part of the reason lay with Police Chief Lori Pritchett. Unlike officials in Birmingham or Montgomery, Pritchett carefully studied King's philosophy. He understood something crucial. Violent responses generated sympathy for demonstrators. Therefore, he instructed officers to remain outwardly calm. No police dogs. No fire hoses. No spectacular beatings before television cameras. Arrests continued. Jails filled. But the dramatic images that had previously shocked the nation largely disappeared. It was, from the movement's perspective, an unexpectedly difficult obstacle. History has a habit of adapting. One side changes tactics, the other adjusts. Then the first adapts again. Progress rarely follows a straight road. King later reflected honestly on Albany's shortcomings. He admitted mistakes had been made. Objectives had been too broad. Strategies needed refinement. It was a painful lesson. Yet valuable ones often are. Failure, while deeply uncomfortable, can become one of history's most patient teachers. As winter gave way to spring in 1962 and then into 1963, movement leaders searched for a city where segregation remained especially visible. A place whose officials might react harshly enough to reveal the true nature of the system before the eyes of the nation. Their attention settled upon Birmingham, Alabama. Few American cities symbolize segregation more completely. Steel mills filled the air with smoke. Factory whistles echoed across neighborhoods before dawn. Church steeples rose above tightly divided communities. The city had earned an unsettling nickname, Birmingham. The name was no exaggeration. Over previous years, numerous homes belonging to African American families and civil rights activists had been bombed. Explosions had become so common that some residents sadly measured time by them. Imagine living in a neighborhood where hearing an explosion at night no longer surprises you. Fear can become routine. That may be its cruelest trick. The city's commissioner of public safety was a man named Eugene Bull Connor. Connor believed deeply in maintaining segregation. He also possessed a famously explosive temper. Civil rights organizers quietly suspected that if challenged publicly, he might respond exactly as they expected. Sometimes movements succeed not because opponents remain calm, but because opponents reveal themselves. The campaign that would unfold in Birmingham would become one of the defining moments of the civil rights movement. It would produce some of the most unforgettable images of the 20th century. Images of children, of courage, of police dogs, of fire hoses powerful enough to strip bark from trees, and images that would force millions of Americans, many of whom had tried for years to look away, to finally confront what equality truly cost. The movement had survived buses set ablaze. It had survived beatings, arrests, and prison cells. Now it was about to face perhaps its greatest test yet, and the eyes of the world were watching. Spring arrived in Birmingham with the quiet confidence that spring always seems to possess. Dogwood blossoms opened along neighborhood streets. Fresh green leaves unfurled across ancient oak trees. Warm breezes drifted through open church windows, carrying the scent of damp earth after gentle rain. If one judged only by the weather, Birmingham seemed almost peaceful. Nature, as usual, refused to acknowledge humanity's endless arguments. But beneath that beautiful spring lay a city wound so tightly that almost everyone expected something to break. Birmingham in 1963 was one of the wealthiest industrial cities in the American South. Steel mills roared day and night. Railroad tracks carried freight in every direction. Smoke drifted lazily above factory chimneys, tinting sunsets shades of orange and gray. Thousands earned their living shaping steel that would become bridges, buildings, automobiles, and machines scattered across the country. Yet while Birmingham helped build modern America, it remained determined to preserve an older social order. Segregation reached into nearly every corner of daily life. Restaurants, hotels, schools, movie theaters, parks, employment, voting, housing. Even the smallest interactions were governed by invisible rules that everyone was expected to understand without asking. As is so often the case with unjust systems, confusion somehow always seemed to benefit those already in power. African American neighborhoods, meanwhile, were full of life despite the obstacles surrounding them. Children raced bicycles down narrow streets. Neighbors gathered on front porches after supper. Barbecue smoke curled gently into the evening sky. Church choirs rehearsed long after sunset. Barbershops buzzed with laughter and debate. Beauty salons became places where news traveled almost faster than the newspapers themselves. Hope continued living ordinary lives. History sometimes focuses so intensely on suffering that it forgets joy also survives, even under oppression. Especially under oppression. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference believed Birmingham presented a unique opportunity. Not because the city would be easy, quite the opposite. Because segregation there was so deeply entrenched that any confrontation would expose its reality to the nation. Local activist Fred Shuttlesworth had already spent years challenging segregation with astonishing courage. His home had been bombed. He had been beaten repeatedly, threatened, arrested. Yet somehow he continued. Friends occasionally wondered whether he possessed an unusual relationship with fear. Shuttlesworth usually answered that fear existed. He simply refused to allow it to make decisions for him. There is wisdom in that distinction. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is deciding that something else matters more. Together, King and Shuttlesworth planned what became known as Project C. The C stood for confrontation. Not violent confrontation, moral confrontation. They intended to challenge segregation so publicly, so persistently, and so peacefully that city officials would either negotiate or reveal the brutality required to preserve segregation. It was an extraordinary strategy. It depended almost entirely upon predicting the behavior of one's opponents. Fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, Bull Connor had spent years making himself remarkably predictable. The campaign began with sit-ins, marches, prayer vigils, small demonstrations. Participants entered segregated businesses politely requesting service. When refused, they remained. When ordered to leave, they stayed. When arrested, they walked peacefully beside police officers. Jails slowly filled. Every arrest carried a purpose. Each demonstrated that maintaining segregation required criminalizing peaceful behavior. Soon hundreds had been jailed, then hundreds more. Money for bail began running dangerously low. Movement leaders faced an uncomfortable problem. If everyone remained imprisoned, who would continue demonstrating? The campaign risked losing momentum. King himself was arrested on Good Friday, April 12, 1963. Photographs showed him entering jail calmly, dressed in a dark suit and narrow tie. Once again, prison walls closed around one of the movement's most recognizable voices. Inside his small cell, King found himself largely isolated. No crowds. No microphones. No cheering supporters. Just quiet. Concrete. Steel bars. Occasional footsteps echoing along distant corridors. It is remarkable how history often pauses during moments of confinement. Outside, cities continue moving. Children continue attending school. Factories continue operating. Rain continues falling. Inside prison, time seems almost to hesitate. Newspapers eventually reached King's cell. Among them was a public statement written by several white Alabama clergymen. They criticized the demonstrations, not because they defended segregation directly. Rather, they argued that the protests were untimely, too disruptive, too confrontational. They urged patience, negotiation, waiting. History has frequently advised oppressed people to wait. It rarely specifies exactly how long. King borrowed scraps of paper, margins of newspapers, anything available. There, inside a jail cell, he began writing what would become one of the most influential documents of the 20th century. The letter from Birmingham jail. His words flowed carefully, not angrily, not bitterly, thoughtfully. He explained why waiting had become impossible. For years now, he wrote, I have heard the word wait. Then he added a sentence that continues echoing across generations. Justice too long delayed is justice denied. Simple. Clear. Difficult to forget. King described parents explaining segregation to confused children. He described humiliation accumulating day after day until patience itself became another form of suffering. Perhaps his most memorable observation concerned moderation. He admitted disappointment not primarily with extremists, but with those who preferred order over justice. People who agreed that equality was desirable. Someday. Eventually. When circumstances became more convenient, King argued that freedom had almost never been granted voluntarily. It had always required determined citizens willing to insist upon it. The letter quietly transformed moral philosophy into deeply personal experience. Today it is studied in schools, universities, seminaries, and law classes around the world. At the time, it was simply one man writing by hand inside a prison cell. History frequently disguises greatness while it is happening. Outside the jail, however, the campaign struggled. Arrests continued. Adult volunteers became increasingly difficult to replace. Businesses remained stubborn. Negotiations stalled. Some organizers quietly wondered whether the movement had reached its limit. Then someone proposed an idea that immediately sparked fierce debate. Students, teenagers, children. Young people had participated in previous demonstrations, but now organizers considered inviting large numbers of school children into the movement. The proposal troubled many adults. Understandably. Was it right to expose children to arrest, to danger, to possible violence? Others answered that many of those same children already lived with daily violence, already experienced segregation every single day, already understood the stakes more clearly than many outsiders imagined. After long discussion, the decision was made. Volunteers began visiting churches, community centers, youth groups, explaining nonviolence, practicing discipline, preparing a new generation. Many of the participants were between 12 and 16 years old. Imagine asking middle school students to change the course of history. Yet that is precisely what happened. On May 2nd, 1963, thousands of young people quietly left classrooms. Some slipped away through side doors. Others simply walked out. They gathered at Birmingham's historic 16th Street Baptist Church. Inside, excitement filled the sanctuary. Nervous laughter. Prayers. Songs. Children who had never before addressed crowds now stood shoulder to shoulder with classmates. Outside, police officers waited. The church doors opened. Groups emerged singing, one wave after another. As each group left, police arrested them. School buses normally carried children to class. Now police wagons carried them to jail. The facilities filled rapidly, then overflowed. Officials borrowed school buses simply to transport prisoners. There were too many children. The city had prepared for protesters. It had not prepared for thousands of determined students. The following day, May 3rd, became one of the defining moments of the civil rights movement. Bull Connor decided stronger measures were necessary. Police dogs appeared. Firefighters rolled enormous hoses into position. These were not ordinary garden hoses. The water pressure could knock adults off their feet, strip bark from trees, tear clothing. Children marched anyway. Connor gave the order. Water exploded from the hoses. Teenagers tumbled across sidewalks. Young girls clung desperately to one another. Boys struggled to stand against torrents powerful enough to lift them from the pavement. Police dogs lunged. Officers wrestled demonstrators toward waiting vehicles. Photographers captured everything. Every spray of water. Every frightened face. Every barking dog. Every peaceful marcher refusing to strike back. Television cameras rolled. That evening, America watched. Families gathered around glowing black and white television sets. Dinner plates sat forgotten. Children grew unusually quiet. Millions witnessed scenes many had previously dismissed as exaggerated. Now they could see them. Not described. Seen. Images possess extraordinary authority. One cannot easily argue with a photograph of a child pinned against a wall by a fire hose. The effect was immediate. Newspapers across the world printed front-page photographs. Foreign governments expressed outrage. Religious leaders condemned the violence. Ordinary Americans who had remained undecided suddenly found themselves asking difficult questions. Was this truly the price of segregation? Could such scenes possibly be justified? Bull Connor believed overwhelming force would frighten demonstrators into submission. Instead, he had revealed segregation more honestly than any civil rights speech ever could. History sometimes defeats injustice by allowing it to display its own face. Negotiations finally began. Business leaders, worried about Birmingham's reputation and economy, pressured city officials toward compromise. An agreement slowly emerged. Downtown businesses would begin desegregating. Some jailed demonstrators would be released. Employment opportunities would gradually improve. It was not complete victory, but it was undeniable progress. Celebrations spread cautiously. Church bells rang. Families embraced. Children smiled through exhaustion. For a brief moment, hope seemed to outweigh fear. Then, only days later, violence struck again. Late one evening, bombs exploded at the Gaston Motel, where King had often stayed, and at the home of King's brother. The blast shook nearby neighborhoods. Crowds gathered. Anger erupted. Some people threw rocks. Police responded aggressively. Smoke once again filled Birmingham streets. Progress, history reminded everyone, rarely travels without resistance. Yet despite the bombs, despite the arrests, despite the hoses and dogs, something fundamental had changed. The conscience of the nation had been awakened. People who had spent years looking away could no longer claim they had not seen. And as summer approached, civil rights leaders began planning something even larger. Not another local campaign, not another single city protest, but a gathering that would bring hundreds of thousands of Americans to the very heart of the nation's capital. A march unlike anything the United States had ever witnessed. A march where, beneath the gaze of Abraham Lincoln's great stone statue, one minister would speak words that would echo far beyond that hot August afternoon. Words that children, decades later, would still memorize. Words that began not with anger, but with a dream. Summer settled gently over Washington, D.C. The air grew thick with humidity long before noon. Heat shimmered above marble monuments. Tourists unfolded paper maps beneath the shade of elm trees, grateful for every passing breeze. Vendors sold cold drinks from small carts. Children chased pigeons across wide stone plazas with the boundless optimism that only children seemed capable of carrying through August afternoons. The Capitol appeared, as capitals often do, both magnificent and strangely ordinary. Government clerks hurried between offices. Secretaries balanced stacks of paperwork. Members of Congress argued behind polished wooden doors. The Lincoln Memorial stood patiently at the western end of the National Mall, exactly where it had stood since 1922, its great columns reflecting in the still waters of the reflecting pool. If monuments possess memories, and one rather hopes they do, Lincoln had already witnessed decades of triumph, grief, celebration, and protest. Soon, he would witness one more. The idea of a great march on Washington was not entirely new. More than 20 years earlier, in 1941, labor leader A. Philip Randolph had threatened to organize a massive march protesting discrimination in defense industries. The mere possibility of tens of thousands gathering in the nation's capital had persuaded President Franklin Roosevelt to issue an executive order banning racial discrimination in those industries. The march itself had never occurred. Its threat had proved sufficient. History occasionally changes direction because someone packs their suitcase. Now Randolph returned to the idea. Older. Wiser. Hair grayer than before. His voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades waiting for the nation to catch up with his convictions. This time, however, the march would not merely protest employment discrimination. It would call for jobs, freedom, voting rights, school integration, fair wages, equal opportunity. Its official name reflected those broad ambitions. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Planning such an event required astonishing coordination. Buses needed organizing. Volunteers recruited. Food arranged. Medical teams prepared. Portable toilets installed. Maps printed. Sound systems tested. Security discussed. Reporters contacted. Thousands of details, each seemingly small, together determining whether hundreds of thousands of people could gather peacefully. History remembers speeches. Someone, meanwhile, always has to remember where to place the drinking water. Bayard Rustin became the movement's logistical genius. Bayard Rustin possessed an extraordinary gift for organization. Calm under pressure. Methodical. Patient. If civil rights movements awarded trophies for paperwork, and admittedly they rarely do, Rustin might have filled an entire shelf. He coordinated transportation from every corner of the country. More than 2,000 buses, special trains, chartered airplanes, car caravans, church groups, student organizations, labor unions, religious congregations. Everyone seemed to be coming to Washington, not despite the enormous challenge. Because of it, there remained genuine fears. Government officials worried about violence. Some businesses quietly closed for the day. Hospitals prepared emergency plans. The National Guard remained available if necessary. Newspapers speculated endlessly. Would the gathering remain peaceful? Would angry counter-protesters appear? Would hundreds of thousands of strangers cooperate beneath the summer heat? History had taught Americans to expect crowds. It had not yet taught them to expect crowds like this. Before dawn on August 28, 1963, buses began arriving. Hour after hour. They rolled into Washington from Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Illinois, New York, California, Ohio, Michigan, and dozens of other states. Passengers stepped onto sidewalks carrying homemade signs, lunch bags, folding chairs, and quiet anticipation. Many had traveled through the night. Some had never before visited the nation's capital. Others had never before left their home state. The journey itself felt historic. Inside buses, strangers shared sandwiches. Church choirs practiced hymns. Children slept against parents' shoulders. Older passengers stared silently through windows, wondering whether they would witness something they had once believed impossible. As the morning advanced, streams of people flowed steadily toward the National Mall. Black families, white families, priests, rabbis, nuns, college students, factory workers, teachers, veterans, celebrities, union members, business owners, children perched on fathers' shoulders, grandparents leaning carefully upon canes. Humanity assembled in astonishing variety. One of the remarkable features of the march was precisely how ordinary so many participants appeared. No uniforms, no elaborate costumes, just summer dresses, white shirts, neckties loosened against the heat, comfortable shoes selected with the practical knowledge that much walking lay ahead. They came carrying hopes rather than weapons. The atmosphere surprised many observers. Instead of chaos, there was remarkable calm. Volunteers directed traffic. People shared drinking water with strangers. Songs drifted across the reflecting pool. Laughter mixed with conversation. Children splashed their hands in fountains despite parents' predictable objections. Some things, thankfully, remain universal. By midday, the crowd had grown enormous. Estimates varied. Roughly 250,000 people. The largest demonstration in American history to that point. Looking across the National Mall, one saw not individuals, but waves of humanity stretching almost beyond sight. Faces reflected in the water. Handmade signs lifted gently above the crowd. Flags stirring lazily beneath brilliant blue skies. The Lincoln Memorial overlooked it all. Abraham Lincoln, carved from white marble, seemed almost to watch quietly. One cannot know what statues think, but if ever one deserved a moment of thoughtful reflection, surely this was it. The program began with music. Mahalia Jackson sang. Mahalia Jackson possessed a voice that seemed capable of filling not merely the National Mall, but the sky itself. Her gospel hymns rolled across the gathering like gentle thunder. Some listeners closed their eyes. Others quietly wept. Music had accompanied the movement from church basements to prison cells. Now it echoed before the nation. Speakers followed one another throughout the afternoon. Labor leaders, religious figures, student representatives, civil rights organizers. Each contributed a different perspective, yet all returned to similar themes: justice, citizenship, human dignity. The speeches were thoughtful, powerful, measured. But everyone knew another speaker remained: Martin Luther King Jr. By 1963, King had become the movement's most recognizable voice. Famous enough that people across the world recognized his face. Yet fame had changed remarkably little about his manner. Friends still described him as approachable, warm, quick to laugh. capable of deep seriousness one moment and easy conversation the next. He understood, however, that the audience before him extended far beyond the 250,000 gathered below. Television cameras stood ready. Millions more would hear these words that evening. King approached the podium carrying prepared remarks. The speech had been revised repeatedly, typed, edited, adjusted. Like most important speeches, it had already lived several lives before reaching the microphone. He began deliberately, calmly. 50 years ago, the opening deliberately echoed Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Standing before Lincoln's memorial, the connection felt natural. King reminded listeners that the Emancipation Proclamation had promised freedom a century earlier. Yet 100 years later, African Americans still lived under segregation and discrimination. He spoke of a promissory note. America, he suggested, had written magnificent promises into its founding documents. The Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. Those promises belonged to every citizen. Yet for millions, the nation had returned that check marked insufficient funds. It was an image everyone understood. Simple, elegant, devastating. The crowd listened intently. Applause rose frequently. King continued following his prepared text. Then something unexpected happened. Standing nearby, Mahalia Jackson called out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." She had heard him speak before. She knew another version of the speech lived within him. King paused briefly. He looked out across the sea of faces. Then he set aside much of the prepared manuscript. What followed became history. "I have a dream." The words floated across the National Mall. Not shouted. Spoken. Measured. Hopeful. King described children judged not by skin color, but by character. He imagined former enemies sitting together as brothers. He envisioned justice flowing across the land. His language blended scripture, poetry, constitutional ideals, and everyday humanity into something extraordinarily memorable. The repetition became almost musical. "I have a dream." Again. And again. Each phrase rising slightly higher. Each image widening the horizon. He concluded with another refrain. "Let freedom ring." From mountains. From hills. From every corner of America, the speech ended. For a heartbeat. Silence. Then applause surged like a wave. People embraced. Some cried openly. Others simply stood quietly, absorbing what they had witnessed. History often announces itself only afterward. Few present could fully understand that these words would be quoted by school children generations later. That historians would analyze every paragraph. That millions around the globe would eventually recognize those opening 4 words. The march itself achieved something profound. It demonstrated not only the size of the movement, but its remarkable discipline. 250,000 people, peacefully assembled, peacefully dispersed. Predictions of disorder dissolved beneath the evidence of cooperation. The nation had witnessed something extraordinary. Yet beneath the celebration remained sobering reality. A speech, however magnificent, could not by itself dismantle segregation. Dreams require laws. Laws require courage. Courage often demands sacrifice. And only a few weeks later, that sacrifice would become heartbreakingly real. Back in Birmingham, at the very church that had served as a headquarters for the movement, a quiet Sunday morning would be shattered by an explosion. For little girls preparing for worship would never return home. The civil rights movement had inspired hope before the eyes of the world. Now it would once again confront the terrible cost of hatred. And America would be forced to ask itself, with painful urgency, how many more innocent lives would be lost before equality was no longer treated as a dream, but as a promise finally kept. There is something uniquely peaceful about a Sunday morning. The world seems to breathe a little more slowly. Church bells drift across neighborhoods before the streets grow busy. Families dress in their best clothes. Children complain, gently. One hopes that polished shoes are uncomfortable. Choir members rehearse familiar hymns while sunlight pours through stained glass windows, scattering brilliant patches of color across polished wooden pews. Even those who never attend church can usually recognize the feeling. A sense that, for a few hours at least, the ordinary worries of the week have been asked politely to wait outside. On September 15, 1963, that was exactly the sort of morning Birmingham expected. No one imagined history was already counting down the minutes. The 16th Street Baptist Church stood proudly near the heart of the city's black community. Its red brick walls had witnessed weddings, funerals, baptisms, choir rehearsals, Bible studies, community meetings, and, more recently, planning sessions for the civil rights movement. The church had become far more than a place of worship. It was a gathering place, a classroom, a headquarters, a sanctuary in every sense of the word. Children knew every hallway, every staircase, every creaking floorboard. Many had grown up running through those corridors after Sunday services while adults lingered in conversation. To them, it was simply church. Safe. Familiar. Home. That morning, members of the congregation arrived as they always had. Parents greeted friends. Choir robes rustled softly. The smell of perfume mingled with polished wood and fresh flowers arranged near the pulpit. Laughter echoed downstairs where children prepared for Youth Day services. For young girls gathered together in the church basement. They adjusted dresses, straightened ribbons, talked about ordinary things, school, friends, perhaps what they hoped to do later that afternoon. Children possess a remarkable ability to focus on the present. History had other plans. Those girls were Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley. They were 14, 11, 14. Children. Nothing more complicated than that. Children. At 10:22 that morning, an explosion tore through the church. The blast was immense. Windows shattered across the neighborhood. Dust filled the sanctuary. Brick and timber exploded outward into the street. The stained glass windows, which had filled the building with colored light only moments before, burst into thousands of glittering fragments. Outside, birds erupted into the sky. People several blocks away froze in confusion. Some thought a boiler had exploded. Others feared an industrial accident. Within seconds, smoke began pouring from the damaged building. Then came the screaming. Congregation members stumbled through clouds of dust. Parents shouted desperately for children. Neighbors ran toward the church instead of away from it. Firefighters, police officers, volunteers. Anyone nearby rushed to help. Inside, the sanctuary had become almost unrecognizable. Pews overturned. Glass covered the floor. Pieces of plaster drifted through shafts of sunlight like pale snow. The basement suffered the worst destruction. Rescuers clawed through debris with bleeding hands. They lifted broken beams, moved bricks one by one, praying. Always praying. Hope lingered stubbornly, even when evidence grew unbearable. Eventually, rescuers found the girls. America would never forget their names. The bombing shocked even many who had long defended segregation. Violence against peaceful demonstrators had already horrified the nation. Violence against children attending Sunday school crossed another line entirely. The grief spread quickly beyond Birmingham. Newspapers interrupted their editions. Television broadcasters abandoned regular programming. Churches across America prayed for families they had never met. In Birmingham, thousands attended the funerals. The city seemed wrapped in mourning. Martin Luther King Jr. sent words of comfort to the grieving families. He urged them not to surrender to hatred. Those were extraordinarily difficult words to speak, perhaps even more difficult to hear. There are moments when forgiveness feels almost impossible. History does not ask easy things of ordinary people. As if the day itself had not already carried enough sorrow, more violence followed. That afternoon, racial tensions erupted elsewhere in Birmingham. Two young African-American boys, Johnny Robinson and Virgil Ware, were killed in separate incidents. By sunset, 6 young lives had been lost. One Sunday. One city. Too much grief for a single day. The nation struggled to comprehend it. Letters poured into the White House. Churches organized memorial services. Editorial writers abandoned cautious language. Something fundamental had shifted. People who had remained undecided increasingly concluded that segregation itself, not merely isolated acts of violence, had created conditions in which such tragedies became possible. Public opinion, slowly but unmistakably, continued changing. Sometimes history moves because hearts change. Sometimes hearts change because they are broken. Inside the White House, President John F. Kennedy had already begun reconsidering his approach to civil rights. When Kennedy entered office in 1961, he had proceeded cautiously. He worried about maintaining political support. Southern members of Congress held enormous influence. Too much pressure might jeopardize other legislation. Politics, as always, involved balancing competing priorities. Yet Birmingham had changed the equation. The photographs of children facing police dogs, the images of fire hoses, the bombing of a church. These events accumulated until caution itself began looking increasingly inadequate. On June 11, 1963, months before the bombing but after Birmingham's demonstrations, Kennedy addressed the nation on television. His speech marked a turning point. Rather than discussing civil rights primarily as a legal issue, he described it as a moral one. "We are confronted primarily with a moral issue," he declared. The words mattered. Laws regulate behavior. Morality examines conscience. Kennedy announced that his administration would propose sweeping civil rights legislation. It promised stronger protections against discrimination in public accommodations, greater authority to enforce school integration, improved safeguards for voting rights. The proposal faced fierce opposition. Many lawmakers promised to block it. Lengthy congressional battles appeared inevitable. Still, the bill existed. For decades, civil rights leaders had demanded federal action. Now, at last, the White House had committed itself publicly. Hope grew cautiously. But history, once again, had little interest in allowing events to unfold peacefully. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy traveled to Dallas, Texas. The day began brightly. Crowds lined city streets. Children waved flags. Motorcades generally produce an atmosphere of celebration. No one expected tragedy. Then, shortly after noon, gunfire echoed through Dealey Plaza. Kennedy was assassinated. News spread with astonishing speed. Television stations interrupted broadcasts. Radio announcers struggled to steady trembling voices. Schools dismissed students early. Factories fell strangely quiet. Across America, people gathered around televisions in stunned silence. The nation mourned. Civil rights leaders mourned. Even opponents often expressed genuine shock. History had once again taken an abrupt, heartbreaking turn. Many feared Kennedy's civil rights bill would now disappear. Presidents can champion legislation. Assassinations often bury it. Instead, something unexpected happened. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson became president. Johnson understood Congress as few presidents ever had. A former Senate Majority Leader, he knew every committee chairman, every procedural obstacle, every political pressure point. He also understood the emotional weight of Kennedy's death. Addressing Congress, Johnson urged lawmakers to honor Kennedy's memory. "Let us continue." The phrase became more than rhetoric. Johnson invested enormous political energy into passing the Civil Rights Act. He negotiated relentlessly, persuaded hesitant senators, confronted determined opponents. The debates lasted months. Southern senators launched one of the longest filibusters in American history. Hour after hour, day after day, speech after speech. They hoped endless talking might stop history itself. History, however, possesses remarkable patience. Eventually, debate ended. The Senate voted. The House approved the final version. On July 2, 1964, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. Pens scratched softly across paper. Applause filled the room. The legislation outlawed segregation in hotels, restaurants, theaters, and other public accommodations. It prohibited employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It strengthened the federal government's ability to enforce school desegregation. It represented the most significant civil rights legislation since Reconstruction nearly a century earlier. One signature could not erase prejudice. No law has ever possessed such magic. But laws matter. They establish boundaries. They declare, in unmistakable language, what a society is willing or no longer willing to tolerate. For millions of Americans, doors that had remained closed for generations finally began to open. Not all at once. Not without resistance. But undeniably. Still, one profound injustice remained. Across much of the South, countless African Americans continued finding it extraordinarily difficult to vote. Poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation, economic retaliation, violence. The Constitution promised the right. Reality frequently denied it. The movement had dismantled segregation in public places. Now it turned toward democracy itself. Because without the ballot, every other victory remained vulnerable. And in a small Alabama city named Selma, ordinary citizens would soon begin another march. One that would carry them across a bridge, into history, and into one of the defining confrontations of the entire civil rights movement. Some roads become famous not because of where they lead, but because of what happens upon them. Most bridges spend their entire existence performing wonderfully uneventful work. They connect one side of a river to the other. People cross. Cars rumble overhead. Birds build nests beneath steel beams. The bridge asks for no applause. It simply endures. The Edmund Pettus Bridge was built to do exactly that. For decades, it carried ordinary traffic across the Alabama River. Farm trucks, school buses, families returning home after church. Nothing about its graceful steel arch suggested it would someday become one of the most recognizable landmarks in the history of democracy. History has a remarkable talent for choosing ordinary places to host extraordinary moments. Selma, Alabama, was not a large city. Its streets curved gently through neighborhoods lined with modest homes and old brick buildings. The Alabama River moved quietly beside the town, reflecting broad southern skies that seemed almost impossibly peaceful. At first glance, Selma appeared much like dozens of other southern communities. People greeted neighbors from front porches. Storekeepers unlocked doors each morning. Children rode bicycles beneath towering pecan trees. Life continued with familiar rhythms. Yet beneath those rhythms lay an astonishing contradiction. Dallas County, where Selma was located, had a population that was majority African American, but only a tiny fraction of black residents were registered to vote. Not because they lacked interest, because the system had been carefully designed to prevent it. Imagine walking into a courthouse to register. You have worked, paid taxes, raised children, served your country. The Constitution says you possess the right to vote. Yet the clerk hands you a literacy examination so absurdly difficult that even many lawyers might hesitate. Questions about obscure constitutional provisions, complicated interpretations, requirements applied unevenly. If officials disliked your answers, you failed. If they disliked your presence, you failed. Sometimes applicants waited all day only to discover the office had suddenly closed. Sometimes employers quietly learned that workers had attempted to register. Jobs disappeared. Loans became difficult. Threats followed. The right to vote existed. Access to that right did not. History often distinguishes carefully between possessing rights and being permitted to exercise them. For years, local activists had worked patiently in Selma. One of the most determined organizations involved was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known simply as SNCC. Unlike some national organizations, SNCC often preferred slow, grassroots organizing. Its volunteers lived within communities, knocked on doors, helped neighbors register, listened more than they spoke. Progress came frustratingly slowly. Weeks became months. Months became years. Courage, they discovered, frequently resembles gardening. One plants seeds knowing someone else may enjoy the harvest. Among the movement's young leaders remained John Lewis, still remarkably soft-spoken, still possessing that quiet determination first forged during Nashville's sit-ins. Friends described him as almost gentle. His opponents repeatedly discovered that gentleness should never be mistaken for weakness. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference eventually joined the Selma campaign. Together, National attention and local persistence created new momentum. Daily demonstrations began. Groups of ordinary citizens walked peacefully toward the courthouse to register. Sheriff's deputies arrested them. Again. And again. And again. The county sheriff, Jim Clark, became notorious for his aggressive tactics. He wore a helmet during demonstrations, carried a club, often confronted peaceful protesters with visible anger. Television cameras frequently captured his confrontations. One begins to notice a recurring pattern throughout the civil rights movement. Again and again, officials believed displays of force would discourage activism. Again and again, those same displays instead persuaded millions watching at home that something was profoundly wrong. Sometimes oppression proved surprisingly poor at public relations. Then tragedy struck. On the evening of February 18, 1965, a nighttime demonstration took place in the nearby town of Marion. Streetlights cast long shadows across dark sidewalks. Reporters struggled to photograph events beneath dim lighting. Tension filled the air. Police suddenly attacked demonstrators. People scattered in confusion. Among those present was a young man named Jimmy Lee Jackson. Jackson was 26 years old. He had come to protect his family. Inside a nearby cafe, officers confronted demonstrators. Jackson attempted to shield his mother and grandfather. A state trooper shot him. He lingered in the hospital for several days before dying. His death devastated the movement. Another funeral. Another grieving family. Another reminder that the struggle for voting rights demanded an extraordinary price. Leaders began discussing how best to honor Jackson's sacrifice. Someone proposed a march, not merely through Selma, all the way to Montgomery, Alabama's capital, 54 miles. On foot. The destination mattered. Governor George Wallace had become one of the nation's most outspoken defenders of segregation. Marchers intended to carry their demands directly to the steps of the state capitol. The plan was ambitious, peaceful, entirely legal. Officials responded by promising resistance. Sunday, March 7, 1965. The morning dawned cool beneath pale Alabama skies. Around 600 people gathered at Brown Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church. Some prayed quietly. Others adjusted backpacks. A few carried toothbrushes and spare socks, expecting several days of walking. Many wore comfortable shoes. History has an odd tendency to depend upon practical footwear. John Lewis stood near the front. Beside him walked the Reverend Hosea Williams. The mood remained solemn. No one knew exactly what awaited them beyond the city limits. Still, they began walking. The march moved through Selma's quiet streets. Residents watched from porches. Some waved encouragement. Others remained expressionless. Church bells echoed faintly in the distance. The sound of footsteps became almost rhythmic. Hundreds walking together. Calmly. Purposefully. Soon the march reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The bridge rises gradually. For several moments, those climbing cannot see what lies on the opposite side. Steel beams frame the sky. The city disappears behind. Only the crest remains ahead. Imagine reaching that highest point, taking another step, and suddenly seeing them. Across the highway stood a line of Alabama state troopers. Deputies on horseback waited nearby. Sheriff Jim Clark's posse stood ready. Helmets gleamed beneath the afternoon sun. Clubs hung at officers' sides. Tear gas masks waited nearby. The contrast could not have been sharper. On one side, citizens carrying backpacks. On the other, armed law enforcement prepared for confrontation. Major John Cloud stepped forward. He announced that the gathering was unlawful. The marchers had 2 minutes to disperse. Witnesses later recalled that barely enough time passed to breathe. Then came the order. The troopers advanced. Tear gas exploded into the air. White clouds rolled across the bridge. People coughed violently. Eyes burned. Then officers charged. Clubs swung. Horsemen galloped into fleeing demonstrators. Men and women fell onto the pavement. Some attempted to shield one another. Others crawled through choking gas, searching desperately for open air. John Lewis suffered a fractured skull. His backpack became stained with blood. Television cameras captured nearly everything. Photographers kept shooting despite the chaos surrounding them. The marchers never struck back. Within minutes, the bridge had become a scene of confusion, fear, and remarkable courage. The day entered history under a haunting name: Bloody Sunday. That evening, the footage aired across the United States. Millions of Americans sat before television screens in stunned silence. Families expecting ordinary Sunday programming instead watched peaceful citizens beaten while attempting to exercise constitutional rights. The timing proved extraordinary. Many viewers had just returned from church. Some watched still wearing Sunday clothes. The contrast between morning sermons about justice and evening images of brutality struck deeply. Letters flooded Washington. Religious leaders denounced the violence. People who had remained uncertain suddenly found themselves choosing sides. Sometimes history compresses years of moral debate into a single evening's broadcast. Martin Luther King Jr., who had not been present that Sunday, immediately called for clergy from across the nation to come to Selma. They came. Priests, ministers, rabbis, nuns, students, ordinary citizens. Airports filled with travelers carrying little more than overnight bags and determined hearts. Selma became not merely an Alabama story. It became America's story. 2 days later, King led another march to the bridge. This time, under a federal court order still being considered, he stopped, knelt in prayer, and turned the marchers back rather than provoke another massacre. Some criticized the decision. Others understood the delicate legal strategy. Leadership often requires making choices that satisfy almost no one in the moment. While tensions remained high, another tragedy unfolded. A white minister from Boston, James Reeb, was attacked after supporting the Selma movement. He died from his injuries 2 days later. His death drew even greater national attention. Soon afterward, a federal judge ruled that the march to Montgomery could proceed under protection. At last, the road opened, and thousands prepared once again to place one foot in front of the other, not knowing that this time, they would complete the journey all the way to Alabama's capital, where their voices would help inspire one of the most important pieces of voting rights legislation in American history. There is a particular rhythm to walking long distances. At first, every step feels intentional. You notice the sound of your shoes against the road, the weight of your backpack, the warmth of the morning sun creeping across your shoulders. But after several miles, something changes. Your breathing settles into a steady cadence. Conversation becomes quieter. The miles begin to measure themselves not in numbers, but in songs, shared silence, and the simple determination to keep placing one foot in front of the other. Perhaps that is why marches have appeared throughout history so often. Walking has a way of transforming individuals into a community. No one arrives 50 miles alone. On March 21st, 1965, the march from Selma to Montgomery began again. This time, everything felt different. A federal judge had ruled that the demonstrators had a constitutional right to march peacefully. President Lyndon B. Johnson had ordered federal protection, United States Army troops, National Guard units under federal authority, federal marshals. Thousands of law enforcement officers now stood ready, not to stop the march, to protect it. History possesses a wonderful sense of irony. Only 2 weeks earlier, peaceful citizens had been beaten while attempting to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Now the federal government escorted them across the very same bridge. The steel arches had not changed. The river still flowed quietly beneath them. The spring breeze still carried the scent of fresh grass and damp earth. Yet the meaning of the bridge had changed forever. As the marchers climbed toward its highest point once again, many undoubtedly remembered Bloody Sunday. The tear gas, the screams, the horses, the clubs, the fear. One imagines some hearts beat a little faster. Old memories have a habit of returning when our feet revisit the places where they were made. This time, however, there were no charging troopers waiting beyond the crest. Only open road. The march continued. The journey covered 54 miles. 5 days. Fields stretched endlessly on either side of the highway. Fresh green crops pushed through Alabama soil. Tall pine trees whispered softly whenever the wind passed through them. At night, the stars emerged in astonishing clarity above the countryside. Many marchers slept in tents. Others rested on church floors or inside temporary camps. Volunteers prepared enormous meals. Doctors treated blistered feet. Students massaged aching legs. Church choirs sang beneath open skies. Campfires flickered gently against the darkness. For brief moments, despite everything, the march almost resembled a traveling village. People shared stories, laughed, prayed, argued occasionally over practical matters, as every large group eventually does. History has a tendency to make movements appear perfectly united. Reality is usually much more human. People disagreed. They became tired. Someone almost certainly forgot where something important had been packed. Someone else undoubtedly insisted they knew a shorter route. Large groups remain wonderfully consistent across the centuries. Yet each morning, they kept walking. As news spread, more supporters joined along the route. Farmers waved from fields. Families stood beside highways holding homemade signs. Children perched on fence posts hoping to catch a glimpse of the march. Some offered water. Others simply offered smiles. Small acts. History often survives because of small acts. John Lewis walked despite still recovering from the fractured skull he had suffered on Bloody Sunday. Martin Luther King Jr. marched alongside ministers, labor leaders, students, and ordinary citizens. Among the marchers were people from nearly every walk of American life. Black and white, young and old, religious and secular, rich and poor. Some had spent years organizing. Others had decided only days earlier that they could no longer remain at home. Justice, it seemed, was attracting increasingly diverse company. The closer the march approached Montgomery, the larger it became. What had begun with a few thousand participants gradually swelled into tens of thousands. By March 25th, approximately 25,000 people entered Alabama's capital. The sight astonished observers. The broad avenues filled with humanity. Songs echoed between government buildings. Flags fluttered in the warm spring air. Television helicopters circled overhead. Reporters described one of the largest demonstrations the South had ever witnessed. The march ended at the Alabama state capitol. Its white dome gleamed beneath brilliant sunshine. Standing upon its steps, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered another memorable address. The speech became known as "How Long, Not Long." King acknowledged the suffering that had brought everyone there. He remembered Jimmy Lee Jackson, James Reeb, those beaten on Bloody Sunday, those whose names history might never record. Then he looked toward the future. How long? The question echoed through the crowd. His answer followed immediately. Not long. Not because injustice disappears by itself. Not because history naturally bends toward goodness, but because determined people had chosen to bend it. King reminded listeners that while the road remained difficult, moral progress had become impossible to ignore. The speech carried neither triumph nor bitterness, only quiet confidence. Hope had matured. It no longer depended upon optimism alone. It rested upon evidence. They had walked 54 miles. They had survived. The nation had watched. Only hours after the celebration, tragedy struck again. As volunteers drove supporters back toward Selma, a young white civil rights activist named Viola Liuzzo was ambushed and murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan. She had traveled from Detroit simply to help transport exhausted marchers. Instead, she became another life claimed by hatred. Her death reminded everyone of an uncomfortable truth. Victory and violence often arrive together. Every major step toward equality seemed accompanied by someone attempting to stop it through fear. Yet fear continued losing. Slowly. Painfully. But unmistakably. Inside the White House, President Johnson had watched the events in Selma with growing determination. Only days after Bloody Sunday, before the march to Montgomery had even begun, he addressed a joint session of Congress. Millions watched on television. The speech became one of the defining presidential addresses of the 20th century. Johnson spoke not merely about voting laws. He spoke about citizenship. He reminded Americans that the issue extended beyond one state. beyond one region, beyond one political party. It is wrong, he declared. Deadly wrong. Then, near the conclusion of his speech, something unexpected happened. Johnson adopted the movement's own anthem, "We shall overcome." For a sitting president, to borrow the words of civil rights demonstrators carried extraordinary symbolic weight. Across America, many activists listening at home began quietly crying. Not because the struggle had ended, because, for perhaps the first time, the federal government seemed to be speaking their language. Congress moved more quickly than many expected. Debate remained fierce. Opposition remained determined. Yet the images from Selma had fundamentally altered public opinion. Lawmakers who once hesitated now found delay increasingly difficult to justify. On August 6, 1965, Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. The legislation became one of the most powerful protections of voting rights in American history. It prohibited discriminatory voting practices. Federal examiners could register voters directly in jurisdictions with long histories of discrimination. Literacy tests that had denied countless citizens the ballot effectively disappeared. Federal oversight expanded dramatically. The impact became visible almost immediately. Across the South, African American voter registration increased rapidly. People who had waited decades finally entered courthouses without impossible examinations standing in their way. Many elderly citizens cast ballots for the very first time. Imagine reaching 70 years of age before finally participating fully in your country's democracy. One cannot help wondering what thoughts passed through their minds while marking those first ballots. Perhaps they remembered parents who had never received the opportunity, friends who had died waiting, children who would now inherit something they themselves had been denied. A vote is a remarkably small physical object, just a mark upon paper. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates how much power can reside within such simple things. By the end of 1965, the civil rights movement had achieved victories many would have considered impossible only a decade earlier. School segregation had been declared unconstitutional. Bus segregation had fallen. Public accommodations had been desegregated. The Civil Rights Act had become law. The Voting Rights Act had followed. The legal architecture of Jim Crow was collapsing, brick by brick, law by law. The movement had changed America, but history, as it so often reminds us, never truly ends. Laws can change faster than hearts. Prejudice can survive long after legislation disappears. Economic inequality remained. Housing discrimination persisted. Northern cities wrestled with problems very different from those of the rural South. Many younger activists began asking difficult questions. Was legal equality enough? Could nonviolence alone solve deeper problems of poverty, unemployment, and urban injustice? A new generation prepared to challenge not merely segregation, but inequality itself. And among the voices shaping that next chapter stood a man whose vision differed sharply from Martin Luther King Jr.'s. His name was Malcolm X. His journey, like the nation itself, would prove far more complicated than simple labels could ever capture. By 1965, many Americans believed the civil rights movement had reached its destination. The headlines certainly encouraged that impression. Historic laws had been signed. Television cameras had captured triumphant marches. Presidents had delivered stirring speeches. Congress had acted. If one read only the front pages of newspapers, the story appeared almost complete. There is something comforting about believing history ends neatly. It almost never does. For countless African American families, daily life remained painfully familiar. Schools were still unequal. Neighborhoods remained sharply divided. Finding decent housing could prove nearly impossible. Banks often refused mortgages. Factories frequently reserved better-paying jobs for white workers. Police relationships with black communities remained deeply strained. Children who had watched Martin Luther King Jr. speak now returned to neighborhoods where opportunity remained frustratingly scarce. The law had changed. Life was taking considerably longer. Justice, it turned out, possessed multiple chapters. One voice had been challenging America from a very different direction. His name inspired admiration in some people, fear in others, misunderstanding in many. Malcolm X was unlike Martin Luther King Jr. in almost every visible way. King often spoke in the language of reconciliation. Malcolm frequently spoke in the language of self-respect. King emphasized integration. Malcolm initially questioned whether integration alone could ever produce genuine equality. Television frequently presented them as complete opposites. Reality, as history often insists, was considerably more complicated. Malcolm X had been born Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska, in 1925. His childhood was marked by violence long before he became famous. His father, a Baptist minister who supported black self-determination, died under suspicious circumstances after repeated threats from white supremacist groups. His family fell into poverty. His mother suffered severe emotional distress and was eventually institutionalized. Young Malcolm experienced foster homes, instability, loss. By the time he reached adulthood, America had already taught him many harsh lessons. He later became involved in crime, burglary, drug dealing, street hustling, eventually prison. Many stories might have ended there. His did not. Inside prison, Malcolm transformed himself. He read constantly. History, philosophy, religion, politics, entire dictionaries. He copied words by hand to expand his vocabulary. Books became both education and escape. It remains one of history's quiet reminders that libraries occasionally alter the course of nations. Upon release, Malcolm joined the Nation of Islam. His intelligence, discipline, and remarkable speaking ability quickly made him one of the organization's most recognizable figures. Crowds gathered wherever he spoke. Unlike King, Malcolm rarely asked America politely for justice. He demanded dignity. Immediately. Without apology. Many African Americans found his message deeply compelling, especially younger people growing impatient with endless requests for patience. After all, if peaceful demonstrators could still be beaten, if churches could still be bombed, if children could still die, how long should anyone continue waiting? It was not an unreasonable question. History rarely advances through a single philosophy. Different voices often emerge because different wounds require different language. Yet Malcolm himself was changing. In 1964, he left the Nation of Islam following growing disagreements with its leadership. Soon afterward, he traveled to Mecca. The pilgrimage profoundly affected him. There he encountered Muslims from every race and nationality worshiping together. The experience challenged many of his earlier assumptions. Upon returning to America, Malcolm's outlook became broader. His speeches increasingly emphasized international human rights. He became more open to cooperation with other civil rights leaders. Though differences remained, the distance between Malcolm and King had begun quietly narrowing. One cannot help wondering what conversations they might have shared had time allowed. History, unfortunately, sometimes interrupts its own possibilities. On February 21, 1965, Malcolm X addressed a gathering in New York City. The atmosphere inside the ballroom felt ordinary enough. People settled into seats. Conversations drifted softly through the room. Then, gunfire erupted. Malcolm collapsed before the audience. He was 39 years old. The news spread rapidly. Another leader gone. Another funeral. Another reminder that ideas powerful enough to inspire millions often provoke extraordinary hatred. Today, Malcolm X is remembered with increasing complexity, not merely as the fiery speaker many Americans once imagined, but as a man whose thinking continued evolving until the very end of his life. History sometimes freezes people at one moment. Reality reminds us they kept growing. While national attention focused upon prominent leaders, countless ordinary people quietly continued changing America in less visible ways. Teachers integrated classrooms that had remained separated for generations. School principals faced angry parents while insisting the law would be followed. Restaurant owners removed white-only signs from windows, some reluctantly, some gladly. Bus drivers stopped directing passengers according to race. Libraries opened every reading room. Hotels welcomed guests once turned away. These changes rarely produced dramatic headlines. No famous speeches accompanied them. Yet together they reshaped everyday life. Imagine a little girl entering a public library without wondering whether she belonged there. Imagine ordering lunch without checking which entrance you were expected to use. Imagine voting without first proving your literacy to someone determined that you fail. History often hides inside ordinary afternoons. Not every reaction welcomed these changes. Resistance remained fierce. Some school districts delayed integration for years. Private segregation academies appeared. Political campaigns exploited racial fears. Violence did not disappear. Many activists discovered that legal victories could provoke new forms of opposition. The struggle simply changed shape. This has always been one of history's quieter truths. Systems rarely surrender gracefully. They adapt. Sometimes openly. Sometimes subtly. Progress therefore requires not only winning great battles, but patiently defending each victory afterward. Martin Luther King Jr., meanwhile, had begun looking beyond civil rights alone. He increasingly spoke about poverty, economic opportunity, affordable housing, healthcare. He argued that legal equality meant little if families remained trapped by hunger and unemployment. Some supporters embraced this broader vision. Others worried he was expanding the movement too far. Political allies grew uneasy. The further King moved beyond segregation into questions of economic justice and war, the more complicated his public image became. Fame, he discovered, rarely protects anyone from criticism. Perhaps it merely amplifies it. King also became an increasingly vocal opponent of the Vietnam War. Many advisors warned against combining civil rights with foreign policy. He answered that violence abroad and injustice at home could not easily be separated. The position cost him support. Newspapers criticized him. Political friendships weakened. Poll numbers declined. History remembers King's popularity somewhat selectively. During portions of his life, many Americans strongly disagreed with him. Great moral voices often become easier to admire after time has softened controversy. Meanwhile, younger activists explored new ideas. Organizations such as the Black Panther Party emerged later in the decade, emphasizing community self-defense, education, free breakfast programs for children, and neighborhood health initiatives alongside more militant rhetoric. The phrase Black Power, popularized by Stokely Carmichael, entered public conversation. To supporters, it represented dignity, self-determination, and political strength. To critics, it sounded divisive or threatening. As with so many historical slogans, its meaning often depended upon who was speaking and who was listening. The civil rights movement had never been a single organization, nor a single philosophy, nor a single leader. It was a vast conversation involving ministers, students, labor organizers, lawyers, parents, teachers, veterans, artists, farmers, and children. Sometimes they agreed. Sometimes they argued passionately. That diversity occasionally frustrated observers seeking simple narratives. History politely declines simplicity. Real movements resemble families more than machines, united by purpose, frequently debating method. And yet, despite disagreements, something undeniable had occurred. The America of 1967 no longer resembled the America of 1955. A child entering first grade now encountered a country transformed within barely a decade. Laws had changed. Expectations had changed. Language itself had begun changing. Entire generations of young Americans had grown up watching ordinary citizens challenge seemingly immovable institutions and sometimes succeed. Those lessons would inspire future movements far beyond civil rights. Women's rights, disability rights, LGBTQ+ rights, environmental activism, human rights campaigns around the world. The methods refined in Montgomery, Birmingham, Greensboro, Nashville, and Selma would travel far beyond the American South. One peaceful march could echo across continents. One courageous act could quietly become someone else's beginning. Still, the movement's most recognizable voice continued carrying tremendous weight upon weary shoulders. Martin Luther King Jr. had spent more than a decade marching, preaching, traveling, negotiating, comforting grieving families, enduring arrests, surviving threats, and trying to persuade a divided nation that justice strengthened everyone. He often appeared tireless before crowds. Privately, friends noticed exhaustion. Even the strongest voices eventually grow weary. The final chapter of King's life, and of this remarkable era, was approaching. It would unfold in Memphis, Tennessee, where sanitation workers carrying simple signs reading, "I am a man," would ask the nation once again a question it had still not fully answered. What does equality truly mean? By the spring of 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was only 39 years old. It is a strangely unsettling fact. Photographs often make him appear older, perhaps because history has a habit of placing enormous burdens upon certain faces. Perhaps because years spent comforting grieving families, sleeping too little, traveling endlessly, and carrying the hopes of millions leave marks no calendar can fully explain. He laughed often. Friends remembered that. He enjoyed practical jokes. He loved good food. He worried constantly about deadlines. He occasionally misplaced papers. In other words, he remained wonderfully human. History sometimes turns remarkable people into marble statues. The real Martin Luther King Jr. grew tired. He became discouraged. He doubted himself. And then, despite all of that, he kept going. In Memphis, Tennessee, another struggle had quietly begun. It did not initially concern lunch counters, or voting booths, or buses. It began with garbage. More specifically, with the men responsible for collecting it. The city's sanitation workers performed exhausting, dangerous labor. They lifted heavy metal trash cans day after day beneath the southern sun, worked through rainstorms, cold mornings, oppressive summer afternoons. Many trucks offered little protection from accidents. Pay remained low. Working conditions were poor. Most sanitation workers were African American. Most supervisors were white. One could already sense the familiar imbalance. Then tragedy struck. On February 1st, 1968, two sanitation workers, Echal Cole and Robert Walker, sought shelter from heavy rain inside the rear compartment of a garbage truck. A malfunction occurred. The compactor activated. Both men were crushed to death. Their deaths horrified co-workers. The city offered little compensation, little acknowledgement. To many workers, the message felt painfully familiar. Their labor mattered. Their lives apparently mattered less. Soon afterward, approximately 1,300 sanitation workers went on strike. Their demands sounded remarkably modest. Safer conditions, fair wages, recognition of their union, respect. Perhaps the simplest slogan captured everything. I am a man. Nothing elaborate. No complicated political theory. Just 4 words. A declaration that should never have required repeating. Yet history repeatedly forces human beings to insist upon their own humanity. The workers carried those signs through Memphis streets. White letters against black backgrounds. Simple enough for anyone to read. Impossible to misunderstand. King decided to support the strike. Some advisors questioned the decision. Why become involved in what appeared to be a local labor dispute? King answered that economic justice belonged naturally beside civil rights. Equality meant more than access to restaurants. It meant dignity at work, the ability to support one's family, safety, opportunity. The struggle, in his mind, remained the same. Different chapter. Same story. He arrived in Memphis during March. Crowds welcomed him warmly. A large demonstration was organized. Unfortunately, events unfolded badly. Some participants, particularly younger individuals frustrated after years of slow progress, began breaking windows and damaging property. Police responded forcefully. Chaos spread. One young man was killed. King felt devastated. The march had departed from the discipline of nonviolence he had spent years teaching. He resolved to return. Another march would be organized. This one, he insisted, would remain peaceful. He could not know it would become his final journey. On April 3, 1968, storm clouds gathered above Memphis. Rain lashed against rooftops. Thunder rolled across the city. Many people assumed attendance at King's evening speech would be disappointing because of the weather. Instead, the church filled. People came anyway. Umbrellas dripped near the entrance. Wet coats hung over pews. The atmosphere felt strangely intimate. King himself had considered staying at the motel that evening because he felt exhausted. Friends persuaded him to attend. The speech he delivered became known as, "I've been to the mountaintop." Listening today, one cannot avoid feeling the weight of its closing moments. King spoke about perseverance, about continuing the struggle. Then, almost unexpectedly, his words became deeply personal. He reflected upon the many death threats he had received. He admitted that, naturally, he wanted to live a long life. Then he added something extraordinary. "I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you." The audience applauded. Most assumed he spoke metaphorically. No one imagined how painfully literal those words would soon seem. History occasionally grants moments that feel almost unbearably prophetic. The following evening, April 4th, 1968, the weather had improved. Sunlight faded slowly toward evening. King stood on the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel. Friends gathered below in the parking lot. Someone joked about dinner. King leaned casually over the balcony railing. At 6:01 p.m., a rifle shot shattered the evening. For one impossible moment, silence. Then shouting. Friends rushed toward him. Someone pointed toward a nearby boarding house. Others called desperately for ambulances. King lay motionless on the balcony. Blood stained the concrete beneath him. The ambulance arrived quickly. Doctors fought to save him. Despite every effort, Martin Luther King Jr. died that evening. He was 39 years old. News traveled across America with astonishing speed. Television interrupted programming. Radio stations abandoned scheduled broadcasts. Newspapers rushed out special editions. Many people simply stared at the words in disbelief. Surely not. Surely someone had made a mistake. But history, once again, refused to soften its blow. Church bells rang. Schools dismissed students. Factories paused. Entire cities seemed wrapped in grief. Across the United States, anger erupted. More than 100 cities experienced unrest. Buildings burned. National Guard troops deployed. Communities mourned in profoundly different ways. Some through prayer. Some through tears. Some through rage. The nation had lost one of its clearest moral voices, and millions struggled to imagine what came next. King's funeral took place on April 9th in Atlanta. More than 100,000 people lined the streets. World leaders attended. Religious figures. Ordinary citizens. Children who had marched in Birmingham. Workers from Memphis. People whose lives King had never known he had touched. His casket was eventually placed upon a simple farm wagon pulled by 2 mules. The image carried quiet symbolism. No elaborate carriage. No military procession. Just an ordinary wagon, slowly moving through streets filled with mourners. Even in death, simplicity remained. Perhaps it suited him. The funeral service included one of King's own recorded sermons. His voice filled the church once more. Calm. Measured. Reflective. Listeners heard him ask that people remember not awards or honors, but whether he had tried to serve others. There was something profoundly fitting about allowing him, one last time, to speak for himself. Only days later, Congress completed work on another important piece of legislation. On April 11, 1968, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, Fair Housing Act. The law prohibited racial discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. It addressed one of the movement's remaining major legal battles. Many lawmakers later acknowledged that King's assassination created renewed urgency, even in death. His influence continued shaping the nation. Yet legislation, important though it was, could never replace the man himself. Friends remembered quieter things. His laugh. His habit of staying up too late preparing speeches. His love of gospel music. His concern for his children. History often remembers the microphone. Families remember the dinner table. By the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement had transformed the United States more profoundly than almost anyone in 1954 could have imagined. Jim Crow segregation, once protected by law across much of the South, had largely collapsed. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, federal courts, grassroots organizers, students, churches, teachers, parents, children, Countless ordinary people had reshaped their country together. No single individual accomplished it. Not King. Not Rosa Parks. Not John Lewis. Not Malcolm X. Not any president. Movements, like rivers, are fed by thousands of smaller streams. Some famous. Most anonymous. History remembers the leaders because it needs faces. Justice survives because millions of unnamed people quietly decide to keep walking. And that, perhaps, is the most hopeful lesson of all. The greatest changes rarely arrive because extraordinary people rescue everyone else. They arrive because ordinary people decide that ordinary life can, and should, become more just. As evening settles over this long story, imagine those roads once more. A Montgomery sidewalk where one woman remained seated. A Greensboro lunch counter where 4 students quietly ordered coffee. A Birmingham church where children sang hymns. A bridge in Selma stretching across still water. A crowded national mall beneath the gaze of Abraham Lincoln. They are quiet now. Traffic passes. Tourists take photographs. Children laugh without always knowing the stories beneath their feet. History has a gentle habit of hiding inside ordinary places. If you ever visit them, pause for a moment. Listen carefully. Perhaps you will hear only wind moving through trees, or distant footsteps echoing across old pavement. Or perhaps, if the night is quiet enough, you will hear something else. The patient rhythm of countless ordinary people walking together toward a future they could not yet see. One step, then another, then another. Never perfectly, never easily, but always forward. And somewhere beyond the fading light, where memory meets hope, those footsteps continue, not because history demands them, but because every generation is eventually asked the same quiet question. What kind of road will you leave behind for those who walk after you? Good night.